ketogenics was something, it really was transformational. And as I discovered ketogenics through you, I'm very curious to hear, you no longer feel the same that you did. What changed?
Well, it's a broader topic, I think, around that of dietary restriction. So I think my aperture has just widened significantly. So you have to take a step way back and ask the question, what are the ways in which one can change their diet? So let's come back to your example in a moment, because I think if I recall, when you went on a ketogenic diet, it wasn't in an effort to lose weight.
No.
Yeah. So let's put your case aside for a moment and instead discuss it through the lens of how most people think about ketogenic diets, vegan diets, pick your diets. It's usually some form of energy restriction. So I think initially I was, like most people are, pretty myopic about my views of energy restriction. And over time, that thinking evolved into saying, look, there are really, broadly speaking, 3 strategies to reduce intake. One strategy is to just directly fixate on the reduction of energy intake. That's called caloric restriction. So bodybuilders are a great example of this, right? Like they really know how to weigh and measure every single thing they're eating, and they certainly understand during an anabolic phase, this is how much energy I need. During a catabolic phase or cutting phase, I need this much. And they've got this down to a science, and it's really remarkable. I mean,
but it's a science optimized for the reduction of fat.
That's right. That's right.
And maintenance of muscle.
That's exactly right.
Not longevity.
That's right.
Just for anybody
paying absolutely attention. Right. But let's be clear. Like, I don't think there's a better example of any type of person on the planet that's figured out how to control intake up and down and to produce a perfect result with respect to that aesthetic.
Well said.
And for most people, that's really hard to do. It's hard to do because you can't really ignore it. Like you can't just eat without thinking. You always have to be paying attention to what you're doing. But it is the most direct way to go about getting the results you want. So that's method 1. Method 2 says, how about I don't pay attention to what I'm eating or when I'm eating, but I pay attention, how about I don't pay attention to what I'm eating or how much I'm eating, but I just pay attention to when I eat. So that's called time restriction. People call that intermittent fasting. And if I make the window in which I eat small enough, I will reduce energy intake in total. So if I said to you, you can only have 1 meal a day, chances are you are going to lose weight. Now, people thought that, well, there must be something magical about intermittent fasting beyond the caloric reduction, but that turns out to not be the case. It's been tested in several studies now, and it's clear that if you eat 2,000 calories in one sitting, it's no better or worse for you, at least from a weight perspective, than if you eat 2,000 calories spread out over the course of a day. It's probably worse for you in another way, though, which is you're a little more likely to lose muscle mass because you won't be able to get the right amount of amino acids into your muscles.
I don't want to derail your point, but we are going to have to talk about autophagy because I intermittent fast like a fiend.
Great. We'll
365.
Yeah. Okay. So then we get to the third method of caloric reduction, which is the use of what's called dietary restriction. So here we pick things within the diet and we cut them out. And the more restrictive that is, the more likely it is to produce an energy reduction, and therefore the more likely you are to achieve the goal of weight loss. So the glib example I always give is, if you went on the no lettuce diet, you would not lose an ounce, right? It's simply not restrictive enough. If you went on the only potato diet, you would lose an insane amount of weight. You simply couldn't eat enough potatoes to maintain. Now, that's not a healthy diet, right? No one would think that the all potato diet is going to produce an ideal health outcome, but you will lose a lot of weight.
Right.
So keto is simply a very restrictive form of that diet. And many people lose a lot of weight on a ketogenic diet because they are limiting so many things, right? They're limiting so many carbs. It's also, for many people, much more satiating. So it actually readily reduces their hunger. And so they simply don't want to eat more. So they have fewer food choices and they don't want to eat as much. But you can gain weight on a ketogenic diet if you eat a lot. You have to be careful because you're generally eating more energy-dense foods on a ketogenic diet. And I've seen lots of people blow up on ketogenic diets because they somehow think it's a license to eat as much fat as they want. Not the case. So now let's talk about, so that's, that sort of coming to that conclusion made me realize, oh, well, there's nothing really magical about any particular diet when it comes to energy balance. But now each of these diets has their own trade-offs around other metrics of health. So, for example, we talked about the importance of protein. Protein is, I think, the most important of the macronutrients. I know everybody wants to argue about fat and carbs, but I think the game is won and lost with protein. And, you know, the recommended dietary allowance of protein is unfortunately very low. So most people are being told to eat 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight, and that's literally half what you need to be eating.
Whoa.
Yeah, that's the amount of protein.
For body mass that I carry, or ideal body mass?
Total body weight. Yeah.
So if I, at 6 foot, weighed 250 pounds, I'm going to be wanting to eat something like 1.6x that in protein?
In kilograms. So yeah. So if you were whatever, 200 pounds, I would want you consuming at least 160 grams of protein. And maybe closer to 200, depending on your demand and depending on your age and depending on the type of protein you're getting. So a lot of different diets. Let's pick two that I think one has to be, they're doable, but you have to be careful about getting enough protein. So let's start with a plant-based diet. So plant-based diet, by definition, you can't have any animal protein. So all of a sudden, you're doing away with the best form of amino acids. You know, one could argue that when we eat animals or animal protein, it is a more pure synthesis of the amino acids that are coming from plants, right? So like a cow, all it's eating is plant, but you eat a cow, or like venison is one of my favorite things, right? So I'm eating wild venison from Hawaii that only eats grass, and yet it's the richest source of amino acids I can sink my teeth into. In other words, its digestive system, its metabolism is doing this remarkable thing I can't do, which is turning grass into the richest, densest source of protein. If I want to go back and eat the grass, it's fine, but I just have to acknowledge I'm going to have to eat a lot more of it because it's not a great source of protein. So the bioavailability of plant protein is about 70% that of animal protein, and it's not as rich in the most important amino acids. So when we have patients who are plant-based, and they say, oh, do I have to give up my plant-based diet? I say, not necessarily. And if it's working for you in all other ways other than this, then there's a workaround here. But the workaround requires you being very deliberate about your protein quantity. Another example is you. So we're going to come back to the case that you just said, which is, what about people who are intermittently fasting? Do they have to, you know, is that a bad thing? Is that a good thing? Well, it depends. But if a person is intermittently fasting, you're going to see a lot of muscle loss unless they're very thoughtful about their protein intake. So, you know, if a person's intermittently fasting 16-8, you can generally get away with it because in 8 hours, you can get usually at least 3 good servings of protein. But we have a lot of people who are intermittently fasting and they're only eating 2 meals, no snacks. They can't come close to getting the right amount of protein in because you can't have, let's just say you're on the 160 gram a day program. 80 grams twice in your day is not going to cut it because you can't put 80 grams to work. It's too much protein for the body to utilize.
Peter, man, this is so different than how I live.
Well, no, but think about it. Like bodybuilders are very thoughtful of this, right? If you look at bodybuilders,
they're kind of... I thought we debunked all the like 6 meals a day, and you're saying no. Like I actually do need to break it back up into smaller pieces.
If you're optimizing for muscle mass, yes, and it can't be too small. So this is where it gets really crazy. If you're eating really small amounts of protein, like 20 grams at a time, you're not going to get muscle protein synthesis because the liver basically takes first dibs on the protein and undergoes gluconeogenesis. It's just going to make glucose out of protein. So if you just trickle tiny amounts of protein in, you're not getting muscle protein synthesis.
I'm turning it into glucose through a really inefficient process.
Yeah, the liver is turning it into glucose. If you eat tons of protein, and the limit based on the literature seems to be somewhere between 40 and 50 grams in one sitting.
Okay.
Once you exceed 40 to 50 grams in one sitting, the excess just goes into gluconeogenesis.
Huh. Wow. Okay. This is very fascinating.
So if you're trying to get 140 grams a day, you really need to optimize it by 4 times 40.
And wow. Okay, so amazing. This is amazing. I'm always game to change. Okay, so I'm breaking my protein up 4 by 40 if 160 is my goal. What period of time do I need to put between them? Because I would be happy to do that. Like it.
What's your feeding window? What do you like to eat? When to when?
Man, I usually keep it tight, like 4 or 5 hours max.
Okay, so if you really want to do it that way, then you're going to have
Well, I'd only want to do it that way if I need to.
Well, but I'm saying, like, if that's working for you from a weight management standpoint and a total caloric...
I'm a freak of discipline. I will never accidentally gain weight. You don't have to worry about that with me. What you have to worry about with me is right now, I believe that autophagy is necessary to avoid cancer. I don't want to die of cancer, so I intermittent fast to make sure that I'm in autophagy.
But there's no evidence that 20 hours of fasting is sufficient to induce autophagy.
Yeah, see, I thought there was, man. I thought autophagy kicked in at like 15, 16 hours.
In mice.
Like,
But mice will die in 3 days of not eating.
Well, that's bad.
Yeah. So in other words, like, it's apples to oranges. We have
do we know where it kicks in for humans?
No, because we don't have biomarkers for autophagy. My intuition, which might be as useful as a warm bucket of hamster vomit, is that it's probably 3 to 5 days. 3 to 4 days,
Ouch.
maybe.
Do you do any prolonged fasting?
I don't anymore.
Wow.
And I'm not opposed to it. Like, I would probably still do,
If you were diagnosed with cancer, what would you do?
Yeah, I would probably get back to fasting more.
Evidence-based or just throwing everything at it?
Mechanistic. Yeah.
Give me the mechanism.
You
you get into autophagy
deprivation of growth factors. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Also, selective sensitization of cancer versus non-cancer cells during chemo, right? So there is some evidence from Walter Longo's work that when you're undergoing chemotherapy, doing so in a caloric deficit can be beneficial because the cancer cell is differentially and disproportionately stressed by caloric restriction and then the normal cell, and therefore because remember, chemo, the magic of chemo is not that it kills cells or kills cancer cells. It's that it selectively kills cancer cells. Anything can kill a cancer cell. It's how do you kill a cancer cell and not a regular cell?
Right.
So how do you enhance the spread between those two? And it might be that caloric restriction is a way to do it. And it renders the cancer cell even more susceptible. And at the same time that you're hitting it with chemo, it becomes more likely to die at the expense of the healthy cell. That's the mechanism. And there is some data to suggest that that's the case.
Okay, so autophagy we know is going to kick in at kicking in at much longer periods. Deprivation can still help with cancer from a growth factor
Remember, you
standpoint.
also kick in autophagy with exercise. So if you're looking for another,
Really?
absolutely. What is autophagy, right? Autophagy.
Self-eating.
Well, yes. But it's occurring in nutrient absence. And there's a great way to induce cellular energy reduction, which is exercise. When you exercise, cellular energy goes down. That's why exercise increases AMP kinase activity just as fasting does. So you don't want to underestimate the benefit of exercise in tricking the cell into thinking its nutrients are scarce.
Okay, then what kind of exercise? I'm going to guess it has to be the kind that I hate the most. And if VO2 max is the under the curve revealer, it's what we were talking about. Very high intensity, period of rest, very high intensity.
Well, that's how you train VO2 max, but isn't
that what I have to do?
No,
to get
because
VO2
that should only be 20% of your cardio volume. 80% of your cardio volume should be steady state and moderate intensity. Yeah.
Okay, the 80%, I like that a lot better. Interesting.
That's zone 2, as we call it.
Yeah.
And that's done at a level where you could carry out a conversation if you had to, but you don't want to.
Right.
That's the litmus test.
That is a perfect description. Okay, so going back to protein. So maybe, in fact, no. You're saying just flat out the intermittent fasting is probably not helping you at all, and if anything, it's probably making it hard for you to get protein and spare your muscle. You need to spread this out. you spoke in kilograms, which really threw me off.
That's okay. How much do you weigh in pounds?
185.
Okay. So 160 to 180 grams per day. So 4 meals at 40 to 45 grams is perfect for you.
Okay. Spread out over ideally
As long as possible. And to be clear, these don't have to be meals. Like 2 of my 4
45 grams of protein. That's a fucking meal.
It's not though. Think about it. Like, what is that? 200 calories?
It's like a chicken breast.
I mean,
you don't consider that a meal?
That's a rounding error. No, for me, like I have these venison sticks that are 10 like a little jerky venison.
Bought or made?
They're actually now bought. You can now buy them.
I like that.
Yep.
Okay.
So each one is 10 grams of protein and 50 calories. And I will have 5 of those as a snack. There's 50 grams of protein right there with 250 calories. Like, it's nothing.
Okay, what about, are they highly processed? Anything to avoid there? No problem, because they're made by a certain company?
They're made by a company that I'm involved in. So, I mean, I
love it the most, obviously, as a guy that only gets involved with things that I care about and think are real. So
it's called Maui Nui venison.
Okay.
These are, this is a type of deer called axis deer that are invasive to the state of Hawaii. And so they're harvested there in the most humane manner fashionable, which is what allows the animal to be completely stress-free. So they're harvested by sniper at night, under night vision. And
whoa.
Yeah, so if you think about it, like, harvesting an animal is a very stressful thing for an animal. Like, if you're thinking about how a cow is harvested, even if it has the most wonderful life, you know, it's grass-fed, it's out in a pasture, it's not inside, like, all of that might be great. And it is certainly better than the alternative, but the very end of its life is still quite stressful.
This is a moral thing, or does this moral?
No,
I
believe it impacts the quality of the meat.
Interesting.
Right. So think about the cortisol levels that are surging through that animal's body right at the time of its death.
Yeah, but from an evolutionary standpoint, everything got eaten.
Oh, and no. I'm not. That's not a moral question. I'm saying from a health perspective.
Yeah, but I'm saying you're a lion. The gazelle you're chewing on is freaking the fuck out as you eat it alive. So there's no way that can have some major.
No, I think
deleterious.
It actually probably has an impact on taste more than anything else. The other thing is, it's very hard. I mean, this is more of an argument of why I love wild game.
Yeah,
is wild game eats the best plants, the best feed. Right. So when you go to the grocery store and you're buying, you know, a regular grain-fed steak, it's not eating what it evolved to eat. Like, you kind of want things that are as close to eating what they evolved to eat. And, you know, for deer, that's basically grass.
Right.
So, anyway, these things are processed in a way that basically has nothing in them. Right. So I'm just getting pure protein.
Yeah. I don't want to derail us, but this is really interesting. So you snipe the deer at night using night vision goggles. So it basically dies in its sleep.
It dies
very
instantaneously.
Death in its sleep,
yep, dies instantaneously, stress-free.
That is so interesting. How'd you find out about these guys?
I met the founder of the company 5-6 years ago, and we just immediately became friends. I became completely fascinated by the problem that they were trying to solve, which was how, you know, the Hawaiian government is trying to eradicate this species because it is destroying the island. So this is a species of deer that was brought to Hawaii in the 1950s for hunting, but it had no predator. It was brought from India, where its only predator was the tiger. You brought it to Hawaii, it had no predator, and it has now run amok. So it is kind of destroying 3 islands of Hawaii. Maui,
and are they finding a way to do this sustainably now so that they can keep having them?
The goal is by 2030 to have it be sustainable. Right now, they are still not able to do it sustainably. In other words, right now, the deer are still growing at a rate that is too significant.
Jesus. Headshots?
Yes.
Interesting. Wow. I don't know why I find that so fascinating, but that's very interesting. Okay, so back to protein intake.
Right. So point is, you could have a whey protein shake.
Do you want me to wake up? I'm like, chomp chomp into the venison?
Not necessarily.
Or?
Like, I mean, again, it depends on when you like to exercise, for example. So
I should exercise fasted? Is that the point of that?
It depends. If I'm going to exercise first thing in the morning, I do it fasted. If I'm going to wait a couple of hours, I'll have a protein meal first.
But it doesn't matter, because I've always heard that you've got so much glucose if you're eating, and now you're just going to get fat and you're never going to lose weight. It doesn't matter.
No. So I generally prefer to exercise fasted, but if the workout is getting pushed till later, a couple hours later, I'm going to have something before, not because I need to, but because I want to make sure I spread out those protein servings enough. Wow. So at least 2 of my protein servings aren't meals. They're like, again, the jerky is not a meal, it's a snack. And then like a whey protein shake, again, 40, 50 grams of whey protein in some, cashew milk.
Would you, I'm willing to stomach the venison snacks and or chicken breast and or eggs.
Yep. Great.
Cool.
Love them.
So if I'm willing to eat the amount of protein that I need in eggs, venison, whatever, would I still do a protein shake?
Not necessarily. No, not at all.
And because I have developed slowly over time a deep aversion to anything that's processed.
Yep.
So I'm trying to get as close to biting into
fantastic.
The walking animal as possible.
Absolutely. Yeah, okay. That's great.
Okay, so but you're not stressed about protein powder.
And then you would have like kind of 2 meals, right? So I'll probably also have like my lunch would be a salad with chicken breast or salmon. And then my dinner's the easiest meal to hit your protein target, right? Like that's like falling off a log.
Just because it's typical to eat a steak, chicken,
whatever you're going to have.
Talk to me, red meat, white meat. Matter?
Again, I think it matters less the color of the meat, matters much more the source of the meat, matters much more about how that animal
grass-fed,
lived.
grain-fed.
Yeah, and how close can you get it to an animal that's in its natural state. Truthfully, it's much easier for me to get wild game that's red meat. Like, I much prefer elk and axis deer, both wild game that either I'm killing or someone I know is killing.
And it's the wild that's the important part.
Yeah. It's an animal that's eating in the environment. It's an animal that's not contained.
Right. And the contained is problematic largely because of the diet that we know they will need?
Yep.
Okay. How much of your protein comes from meat by percentage?
I don't know. I'd have to figure it out, but clearly the majority. Yeah.
Because the one thing I
also like Greek yogurt, by the way. So that's another thing.
That's a hard left. So Greek yogurt has a lot of protein?
It does, actually. It's quite high in protein.
You eat it because of the taste, probiotics?
Just another way to get protein in to diversify a little bit.
From boredom or diversity matters?
Yeah, just some no, just for me, diversity matters. Like I like to mix things up. And it's just, again, it's just a function of time. Like maybe I don't have time to make an omelet right now and I got a quick call I got to jump on. So I can scarf down a bowl of Greek yogurt with some nuts in it.
This seems impossible.
It does take work.
Too good. No, it sounds
work.
Amazing. Like I feel like the way that I live right now would take a lot more discipline than what you're describing. I'll be interested to see if that's true in practice. Okay, so let's fit eggs into the mix here. I'd love to get an idea, knowing that there's a lot of individual variability here. In fact, we should probably talk about saturated fat at the individual level. The one thing in my diet, I do not at all pay attention to how much saturated fat I eat. I don't go out of my way to consume it, but I make zero attempt to avoid it. And because I don't check my blood levels nearly enough, I am always a little hesitant to push my exact diet onto people. Do I need to worry about saturated fat?
Potentially, yeah. Saturated fat can increase your synthesis of cholesterol. It can also, with enough of it being consumed, the liver can sense the amount of saturated fat and basically shut down the clearance of cholesterol, meaning the bringing of cholesterol into the liver.
Can I quote Peter Attia on cholesterol in the book Outlive? If you haven't read it, I highly suggest it. He said, your total cholesterol number is about as meaningful to dying from heart disease as your eye color.
That's right.
So you're bringing up cholesterol, so something matters.
Something about cholesterol matters, but not the total number, right? Total cholesterol is, again, not a particularly relevant number. ApoB, which is the which is a measurement, a laboratory measurement that is the concentration of lipoproteins that carry cholesterol into arteries, that's what you should care deeply about. But when someone says, what's your total cholesterol? 200 milligrams per deciliter, who cares? Doesn't mean anything.
But there is a type of cholesterol that is carried in a certain
so cholesterol, for the most part, that 200 milligrams per deciliter is your total cholesterol, is divided into 3 types of lipoproteins. A high density.
Each has a different carrier?
No, that 200 is the aggregation of approximately 3 lipoproteins. High density lipoprotein, low density lipoprotein, and very low density lipoprotein. So if you look at your lab, you get a blood test done. If it's done correctly, a lot of them are not, but if it's done correctly and they do a direct measurement of LDL cholesterol, you will be able to add up the VLDL cholesterol, the LDL cholesterol, the HDL cholesterol, and the sum of those three will equal the total cholesterol. So if the total cholesterol is 200 and the HDL cholesterol is 70 and the VLDL cholesterol is 20, the LDL cholesterol will be 110.
Yep.
And of those three numbers, we would say the most important insight you could get would be to take total cholesterol, subtract HDL cholesterol, and that number is called non-HDL cholesterol. That number starts to become a pretty good predictor of risk. So total cholesterol.
Because those are damaging in some way.
Yeah, that's now telling you the total cholesterol content of LDL and VLDL, and those are the destructive lipoproteins. Now, an even better number is not how much cholesterol is contained in those two things, but how many of those two things do you have? And that's what's captured by ApoB.
Can you explain that more?
So each of those lipoproteins, the VLDL and the LDL, have a protein wrapped around them. That protein is called apolipoprotein B100, which is a very sexy name. It's abbreviated ApoB. So if you measure ApoB, because LDL and VLDL have one and only one apolipoprotein B100 on them, the ApoB number is the concentration of those two particles. And the gradient of that, the more of those particles you have, the greater the probability that those particles are getting into your artery walls.
Got it. So the number of those do matter. And so
Yes.
if I just subtract out my HDL.
Subtract your HDL from your total cholesterol, you get the cholesterol concentration of those two particles. And that's predictive of risk. But what's more predictive of risk is the number of those particles.
Okay,
which is
how,
ApoB.
How do you, I don't know if this is going to be fruitful, but there's something in that math that I'm not following. So if I got back my cholesterol count and I look at them, I'd be able to tell of my 200, let's say, 110 are the two that are bad, but there's some total number, it sounds like you're
It's a separate
describing.
measurement. You wouldn't impute it from those cholesterol.
So you just have to go to ApoB.
You have to get the ApoB measured. That's
Got
right.
it.
Yeah,
Okay,
it's
so-
another laboratory measurement
Understood.
that is unfortunately rarely done.
Can you just ask your doctor, give me an ApoB measurement?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a relatively inexpensive test. It's about,
People just
depending
don't
on the
do it.
test, it's somewhere between $5 and $20.
Do they not do it because they disagree with you, or they just
They don't
know?
know. They don't know what it is.
Troubling.
Very.
Okay. So in fact, we should talk at least briefly about this idea. So in the book, you talk about medicine 3.0 versus medicine 2.0. Medicine 2.0 is all about curing. Medicine 3.0 is all about prevention. How do
I
we...
would call medicine 2.0 more about treating than curing.
Okay, fair.
It's largely
Very
not
fair.
curative, right?
Very good distinction. Okay, so if you were going to give me the little toolkit of medicine 3.0, how would you begin to bundle that? Like, what are the things that I should be going towards?
Well, again, to your point, so medicine 3.0 really says we've reached the limits of what medicine 2.0 is good for. Medicine 2.0 is really good at curing acute problems. So it's really good at curing infections, traumas, acute issues. It's really bad at treating chronic problems, cancer, recurrent heart disease, neurodegenerative disease, type 2 diabetes. It's really bad at treating those things. And therefore, all it really does is prolong the period of time you have those things. And I go through a lot of explanation in the book as to why that strategy is not the right strategy. So living longer is not accomplished by living longer with disease. Living longer is accomplished by living longer without disease. Once you realize that, you inevitably come to the obvious conclusion that a new type of medicine is needed, which must be focused on extending the period of time you do not have disease. And that word is prevention, which has been bastardized to mean virtually nothing because everybody talks about prevention, but it has no meaning, right? So true prevention has to start very early. True prevention needs a set of tools that Medicine 2.0 doesn't participate in. Medicine 2.0, which is the medical system that every one of us who's trained goes through, is largely a pharmacologic playbook. Now, you're going to get people who sit here and say, all pharmacology is bad, medicine is bad. No, that's not true at all. Pharmacology is wonderful. Pharmacology has done amazing things in Medicine 2.0, and we would want to use all of those pharmacologic tools as needed in Medicine 3.0, but it's literally, 1/5 of the equation. Where is nutrition? Where is exercise? Where is sleep? Where is emotional health? Mm-hmm. Those things are also needed to delay the onset of chronic disease. And none of us got trained in those tools. So if a doctor is going to help their patient with those other 4 tools, they're going to have to learn about it outside of medical training.
That makes sense. Okay, so if we know what we're trying to do is delay the onset of these diseases, you talk about that in the book, that basically the thing that centenarians have in common is that they probably were able to delay the arrival of heart disease, dementia, because you say this, cancer, that these things are building for oftentimes decades, that you can see heart disease in teenagers,
Yep.
Which is pretty crazy. So these are people that have probably delayed the onset of the early symptoms of that for decades more than the people that die at, say, 70 or 80.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. So now then I want to get to, and we'll stay on cholesterol here for a second. So you talk about in the book that dietary cholesterol does not equal cholesterol in your body. So what does? What causes bad cholesterol, being the thing that I'm certainly more concerned about?
So dietary cholesterol is very difficult for our body to absorb. It has a bulky chemical side chain on it called an ester. And the only way we could absorb it is if we have an enzyme to cut the ester off called the deesterified and bring it in. We don't have much of that enzyme. So most of the cholesterol you eat, such as the cholesterol in, shellfish or eggs, you poop out.
Mm.
Okay, so we should just make sure everybody understands that. Eating cholesterol has almost zero bearing on your cholesterol levels in your blood. That doesn't mean that your diet has no bearing on the cholesterol in your blood, but your genes play a very significant role in the levels of your blood lipids. Mm. So we want to always differentiate between cholesterol and lipoproteins. Cholesterol is the cargo. Lipoproteins are the boat. So the term bad cholesterol doesn't actually mean anything. People say LDL is the bad cholesterol. That's actually very inaccurate, right? LDL, low density lipoprotein, is the boat that carries cholesterol, and LDL is bad, but we should really say LDL is the bad lipoprotein. The cholesterol in LDL is the same cholesterol in HDL, which people call good cholesterol. So you can see why it doesn't make any sense. Now, every cell in your body makes cholesterol. So 95% of the cholesterol in your body is cholesterol you made. The reason every cell in your body makes cholesterol is because it is one of the most important molecules in the body. If you couldn't make cholesterol, you would have died in utero. And the reason for it is every cell in your body is wrapped in a membrane, and that membrane is made of cholesterol. Most of the important hormones in your body, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, cortisol, are made from cholesterol. So this hormone is absolutely, this molecule is essential for life, but not every cell can make enough of it. So we have to be able to traffic it between cells. So we have to be able to take it back to the liver. The liver has to be able to package it back out. It has to be able to move around the system. So if your body is like a big city, the superhighway of that body is the circulatory system. And the circulatory system is made of water. So when you cut yourself, you see red stuff come out, but don't let the hemoglobin and platelets and things confuse you. It's just water with a bunch of red proteins in it. And fat doesn't mix with water. Cholesterol is a fat. It's a lipid. and it doesn't dissolve in water. So we can't just move cholesterol around in the blood the way we move glucose or the way that we move sodium or potassium. Those things are dissolving in water. They're called hydrophilic, and they move around freely. Cholesterol is not. It's hydrophobic. It repels water. So that's why we have lipoproteins. We have to have these lipoproteins to move the cholesterol in and out of the body. And that gets to the point of there are basically these different types of lipoproteins. Some of them are very high density. They have lots of protein and a little bit of fat in them. Some of them are low density, lots of fat, less protein, and some are very low density, virtually no protein and lots of fat or cholesterol. And they have different properties. And it turns out that the low density and the very low density ones are the ones that are atherogenic, meaning they're the ones that promote the destruction of your arteries.
Okay, so something is starting to slowly come into focus for me. So fat in the blood is bad.
Cholesterol or fat, which one do you mean?
I mean fat. So when we talk about, if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, there are 2 times now that fat getting loose has sounded like a problem.
Well, let's not. So fat is rarely floating around the bloodstream for the same reason.
But if a lipoprotein, if the very low density is indicated because it has very little protein and a lot of fat.
Well, just when I use fat there, what I'm really referring to is triglyceride and cholesterol, but they're inside the lipoprotein.
But why does it matter that the ratio of protein to fat starts getting low?
It only matters in that that's how I'm describing why they're different in density.
Got it.
Yep.
So it isn't that it is fat that makes them problematic. So what do they do?
What's problematic is that the low density lipoprotein and the very low density lipoprotein are the only ones that seem to make their way into coronary artery walls or artery walls in general, and they have the potential to get stuck in there. So the high density lipoprotein.
Like a shape thing?
No, we don't really have a great sense of it. It's something about ApoB. So HDL, high density lipoprotein, doesn't have ApoB on its surface. It has something called ApoA on its surface. And when a high density lipoprotein goes into the artery wall, it comes back out. When an ApoB particle goes into the artery wall, sometimes it comes out, but sometimes it stays in there. And when it stays in there or gets retained, bad things begin to happen. The first of those things is it undergoes a chemical reaction called oxidation. That chemical reaction called oxidation creates an inflammatory signal. And that tells inflammatory cells called macrophages or monocytes to come. They become macrophages and they eat that oxidized LDL molecule. That's what kicks off a devastating cascade in which the body, ironically and paradoxically, in trying to fix the problem, creates a catastrophic problem that ultimately leads to the creation of a plaque that, if it ruptures, will block the blood supply of the artery and cause a heart attack.
You've got the 2 types that end up basically, they have the ApoB on them. ApoB can get stuck in my arteries. Once it's stuck in my arteries, my body sends an immune response effectively that then ends up creating a problem. Is that calcification?
Calcification is the final stage of the body trying to repair the problem.
Okay.
So think of it as the concrete that gets poured on a melting down nuclear reactor. So when you get a CT scan, that's like what's called a coronary CT scan, to look for calcification, the presence of that calcification, while by itself not problematic, is predictive of something bad that's happened. I describe, I think in the book, calcification is like going through a neighborhood and seeing bars on the windows. The bars on the windows are actually a good thing. They're going to prevent somebody from breaking in.
Right.
But it tells you what kind of neighborhood you're in.
Yeah. Okay. No, that makes a lot of sense. Going on with my diet, one thing that I'm very curious about, and there's a raging debate online, a calorie is just a calorie. Where do you come down on that in terms of the quality of the calorie? Does it matter? If I'm eating, like if you agree that the quality of the calorie matters, but I'm still under eating, do I have a problem?
So the calorie is a calorie discussion always needs some clarification. Are we talking about with respect to energy balance? Are we talking about with respect to nutrition and health? Are we talking about with respect to satiety? And so we have to clarify which of those we're talking about.
All I'm talking about ever is longevity. So
then a calorie is not a calorie, for sure, right? So in other words, if you took a bunch of people and put one group of them on 2,500 calories a day of Twix bars, and another group on 2,500 calories of, one food only, lettuce, or whatever. It wouldn't be 2,500 calories lettuce, but 2,500 calories of
Venison sticks.
and another group on 2,500 calories of some well-rounded diet that's good, blah, blah. They might all end up with the same weight. They might have a different health quality, and I would expect it. I clearly don't expect the guy on 2,500 calories of Twix bars to live as long as the person on 2,500 calories of good food. Nor do I expect them to feel the same. So if you're totally, and by the way, they might end up at slightly different weights because of how they feel. And while you may, in this experiment, control only their intake, you might not be able to control their energy expenditure. So they might actually expend different amounts of energy because of how they feel. So the calorie as a calorie debate, I think, is kind of a silly one, because a lot of times people are talking past each other when they're yelling at each other, and they don't understand what they're talking about. And so, we just have to understand, are we talking about pure controlled, calorimetry, or are we talking about, in your case, what you're asking about, which is, I think, more important, which is health? We are innately really, really bad at estimating risk.
And oddly enough, makes me wonder about you and race cars. So what is it that draws you to race cars? Do you think you're accurately assessing the risk on that?
I will say, that's not an unusual question. I get asked a lot. I think that I feel safer in a race car than I do in my street car.
Really?
Absolutely. I feel far, far more frightened in the drive I have to take tonight from here to San Diego, because I'm going to be on the 405 and the 5, and I know that 80% of people at some point on that drive are going to be checking their phone or losing focus or not paying attention. I don't know what percentage of them, maybe 10% of them are also going to be under the influence of alcohol. And they pose a infinitely greater threat to me than I feel like I could ever face in a race car.
So other than driving, what are some just grotesque misjudgments of the risk in terms of behaviors that people do just on a daily basis?
I think automotive is a very big one. So yeah, it's good that we got that one first. I think another one that people sort of misunderstand is alcohol. I enjoy alcohol as much as anybody, but I don't think people understand how once you get beyond 1 to 2 drinks, like how harmful it is on your liver. And it's sort of like Tylenol, right? Like at any dose, Tylenol is really hard on your liver. But for most of us, because Tylenol has no good feeling associated with it, we don't really tend to use it more than we should. If we have a headache, we take it and it makes the headache go away. But we don't find ourselves like taking 4 Tylenol every day just because of whatever reason. And yet I'm constantly amazed at how much people drink, even when there's no apparent reason for it, right? So there's always a reason to have a drink, right? You can always come up with a great reason to have a drink, but there's too many sort of blah reasons that people are drinking. So I think that that to me is an asymmetric and unnecessary risk, meaning the pleasure that they're getting from that, those 4 shitty Budweisers that they have isn't anything worth the potential downside it's causing in the long run, which says nothing, by the way, of how often I think people do get behind the wheel of their car when they've had a drink in them. And if there's one thing I've learned in the simulator, it's how even one drink compromises your ability when it matters. So I remember—
Simulator, a driving simulator?
Yeah, so I have a driving simulator at home, which is where I do much of my learning. But I remember one day I was like, I was gonna go drive the sim after dinner, and I had a glass of wine with dinner. I remember getting in the simulator and I was like, what in the hell is wrong with me here? Like I am missing every apex, I'm just a little bit off, and I realized, I had a glass of wine. Even one glass of wine is compromising me. So how many times have I gotten in a car having 2 glasses of wine at a restaurant? The answer is tons. Was I legally drunk? No, I was well below 0.08. But even if I'm 0.06, I'm legally fine. Is that still a reasonable strategy?
Right.
And I think the answer is probably not.
You think there are dietary things that people are doing that have just an asymmetric risk reward?
Yeah, You know, I'm probably kind of a huge advocate for caloric restriction, at least intermittent bouts of caloric restriction. So I believe that the short-term discomfort of not eating for 5 days, once, twice, 4, 5 times a year, going through a cycle like that, I think that the short-term inconvenience of that is trivial compared to the potential benefit of a true fast, you know, a water-only fast for some period of time. And I still don't know what that minimum is. I think it's probably a minimum of 3 days are necessary to start to get some of the real benefits of autophagy, mitophagy, and things like that. But
what's the difference between autophagy and mitophagy?
Autophagy is the cell eating itself, and mitophagy specifically is the recycling of the mitochondria.
Okay.
So I think when someone says, and I have many patients or friends or family members who have said like, yeah, that's just, there's no way I could never give up food, even transiently, I think. That's
what do you
an
think
asymmetric
that comes from? Like, not even being willing to give it a shot. Like, what's the emotional hang up? It's because you used to be literally the epitome of the robotic eater, just insanely strict. And you said about 3 years ago, you were like, nope, not doing that anymore. And I think, to quote you exactly, I no longer have the intestinal fortitude to eat like a robot. So there was something in you that it no longer was worth it.
Yeah, that became much harder than what I do today, which is, so back then, I wasn't doing any time-restricted feeding. I wasn't doing any fasting. It was a pure form of dietary restriction. So my sort of mental model for nutrition is everybody is starting out on one side eating the standard American diet, abbreviated as SAD, which is an appropriate abbreviation. And the thing I always tell patients on day one is like, look, the good news is you can't get any worse than this. The only thing, if you're starting at the SAD, the only thing you can do to make it worse is eat more of the SAD.
Right.
But it's like the standard American diet, and I don't believe this was deliberate, right? I don't think there's a conspiracy theory here, but just through a lot of bad luck, has arrived at the absolute worst combination of macronutrients you could possibly imagine. Like, you couldn't come up with a way to confuse someone's metabolism than to combine fats and carbohydrates in the ratios that they are combined in most of the foods that we would eat by default if we were left to our druthers. So from there, I say, look, there's kind of 2 introductory moves, which are not mutually exclusive, but you can pick one or the other. The first is time-restricted feeding, where now you don't limit what you eat, you just limit when you eat it. And then the second is dietary restriction. You don't restrict when you eat, you don't restrict how much you eat, which you also don't restrict in time-restricted feeding, but you restrict certain elements of what you eat. So for those 3 years that I was on a ketogenic diet, which is, I mean, probably one of the most demanding subsets of dietary restriction, you know, I'd pulled that lever as hard as it could be pulled. Then you move into diets that sort of mimic fasting, which is basically just another way of saying hypocaloric diets for transient periods of time. And then ultimately, even beyond that is fasting, just water only, also for limited periods of time. Nowhere in there do I include constant caloric restriction. So, reducing by 20, 30% your energy intake indefinitely. I think the data are pretty clear that that is not a winning strategy. There's something about the cycling into and out of catabolic versus anabolic state. You're basically clearing house, right? You're sort of getting the cells that are themselves defective, and hopefully the ones with the most effective mitochondria. We'd love to target those the most for other reasons. What you want to see is the regrowth. You want to, when you refeed, you want to see the selective repopulation of the better cells. The most robust experiments done on this in primates did not really suggest that as the diet got better, the benefits of caloric restriction got better. In other words, the worse the diet, the better the benefit of caloric restriction, which points us to this idea that dietary restriction should still always be some component of a healthy nutrition strategy.
Meaning, like, if you're eating like shit, stop eating like shit. Stop eating.
If you're eating, if you're committed to never eating anywhere but McDonald's, caloric restriction will have a much bigger effect on you positively than, if your baseline intake is, the way you would eat, for example.
That kind of stuff at like the deep cellular level about where we're going and what this is going to look like is really fascinating to me. Definitely not something that I have the kind of grip on, even remotely close to what you do, but nonetheless seems like if you're really going to get to 100 at a high level, it seems like you're going to have to take that pretty seriously. Now, you've talked a lot about one of the tests that you want to make real is the ability to check for autophagy and to see in the blood. You've thrown out a couple times that this is like, A, you probably know the people that would be creating this test, and B, that it wouldn't be, it's not measured in the billions. So what would that really take? Is it something that could be commercialized and would give people the impetus to put the capital up for it, or what does that future look like?
From a funding perspective, again, this is not like the world's hardest problem to crack. But if I'm going to be completely truthful, I don't know how commercially interesting it is. As a general rule, diagnostic tests are not very commercially interesting. My interests are not remotely commercial. My interest is in just knowing what to do. It's like, I want this test to tell me exactly what the right fasting protocol needs to be. Should I be fasting 3 days a month, 7 days every 3 months, 14 days once a year? Like, I want to know that. And there's no amount of money that would make it worth, not knowing the answer to that question.
Wow, that's a bold statement.
Well, think about it. And I'm not to suggest that like money doesn't matter and money, you can't do great things with money. Like I want money just as much as the next person, but never at the expense. Like I don't want anything to get in the way of the knowledge that can drive living longer. That to me is such a priority that I would rather be poor, but know how to, live longer than have all the money in the world and lose my health.
I totally get that. But I will say one thing I want to talk about is you said that you've said that you think that you eat dysfunctionally even if you don't have an eating disorder, which I actually thought was really interesting. And then you said that part of why you gave up the robotic eating was you were worried about how it was affecting your daughter's view of food. Talk about that, because I think certainly in the movement that we're all going through right now, there's a real risk of that. That if I had kids 5 years ago when I was like, I was shredded. I was so myopically focused on everything that went in my mouth, and I loved it about myself, and I would rave about how much discipline I had. So for sure, if I had kids, they would have been wildly influenced by how much pride I took in not eating. And so, I do worry what that would have done. And I thought it was super sensitive of you to recognize that and change.
Yeah, I mean, my brother actually was he brought this point to my attention first, but he said, be thoughtful about how you describe your own interactions with food. And when you're giving, your kids input on what to eat or what not to eat, try to tether it less to, body dysmorphic ideas and trigger it, peg it more to performance issues, for example, right? Because those things are still true, right? If you eat well or eat poorly, it affects your performance, it affects your cognition, it affects a lot of things. And if the focus is more on those things than on, sort of, Daddy, why aren't you eating this? Because I don't want to be fat. Well, that's, and look, there's a truth to it. Like, I mean, I'm a vain person. I'm not, I've come to a place where I've accepted the fact that I won't look like I used to look, like, because I'm not willing to put in that amount of sacrifice ever again. You and I have the luxury of being old enough to be able to think through that in a slightly less emotional way, and at least make that choice. When I think people who are younger, I don't know. I just don't know if they're equipped fully with the tools to make all of those decisions.
I want to ask you about change. You have changed a lot in your life, like multiple times, from starting out and getting your degree in engineering and mathematics, and then ultimately pulling the first switcheroo over into medicine, then leaving medicine and becoming a consultant, then going into hardcore research and doing nonprofit work, and then now back to medicine. What has allowed you to constantly make those jumps, or what propels you to make those jumps?
I have been able to internalize something that I think is not innate to most people, which is the fallacy of a sunk cost. So the sunk cost fallacy is something that gets talked about in any Econ 101 class, right? So you're you're building a bridge and the cost of the bridge is $10 million and you're $9 million into it and the contractor says, it's going to be another 11 million. For many people, they are evaluating that based on how much money they have already put into the project. And that becomes a very dangerous game because you can't get those dollars back. So instead, you have to evaluate it from the standpoint of exactly where you're standing at that moment in time. And for whatever reason, I've been able to stand at any point in my life and sort of say, I want to do X. I'm going to evaluate that only through the lens of how many years do I have left on Earth, and not at all through the lens of what have I already put into this. And I think that's just made it easier to do things that on the outside look odd, look orthogonal. And then to leave medicine, whatever it was 12 years ago, that was something that a lot of people came to me and said, you got to reconsider this. Like, you've put far too much into this. And I just said, like, look, I'm going to do something for the next 40 years. I want it to be exactly what I want to do. And that's way better to me than saying, well, I'm going to do something that I don't really, really want to do because I've spent the last 10 years doing it, which is where I was. I'd put 10 years into medical school and training, postgraduate training. And it was like, look, that's 10 years I can't get back. And that's a fraction of the time that's still in front of me. So it just seemed very logical to me to always pursue my bliss. And also, I mean, going back to something you said, I think we're in a different world now. I mean, I think the days are long gone of you do one thing for your whole life. I mean, I think for some people that will be the way to do it, and that's great, but it's no longer so ridiculous to have a career change every 5 years. I don't know what I'll be doing in 10 years, but I'd be shocked if it looked exactly like what it looks like today. Like, I think, you know, if you're not growing, if you're not constantly being reminded of how much higher you have to climb, I suspect life becomes a lot less fun.
What drives you?
I mean, truthfully, I wish I could come up with a whole bunch of pleasant, sort of nice things to say. I think in reality, unfortunately, a lot of my drive is insecurity.
That is shocking. And I've heard you say that before. And the first time I heard you say it, I thought that's really fascinating because you're somebody who gives me insecurity. So the fact that you feel insecurity is pretty fascinating. And so as a driver, in what way does that drive you?
David Foster Wallace said in what is unquestionably my absolute favorite 22 minutes that one could ever listen to, which is his commencement speech from 2005 called "This is Water." So, and the first time I ever heard this, it didn't resonate with me. I needed to hear it a few times before it really resonated, where he said, if you worship power, you will forever feel powerless. Right? And that doesn't really resonate with me because I'm not a power seeker, but I absolutely worship intellect. And when the next words out of his mouth are, you will forever feel like a fraud. I'm like, that is so true. I find myself, at least on a daily basis, thinking, dude, I hope people don't find out how much I don't know.
Wow.
And I wish I wasn't saying that. I mean, I really wish I wish I could say, all of my motivations are pure. It's all, I'm Mother Teresa. I just want to fix every problem and make the world a better place. But the reality of it is, like, I think a significant amount of my motivation is just this complete desire to not be found out as a fraud who doesn't know stuff.
I love that for two reasons. One, I think that, and I'll speak very much for myself, from the moment I met you, I was like, this guy fucks with my head. Like, there's just certain people where I'm like, it's hard to feel smart around you. So the fascinating thing is, to hear that that there's some of that driving you. And then two, hopefully people listening to this that aren't comparing themselves to you, but yet are looking at you going, this guy's fucking fascinating. I'm really interested. And they have like a warm feeling for you that's probably equal parts like, oh, he's compassionate towards humanity and that's rad. And then equal parts like, wow, he's fucking smart. That's, he's got cool shit to say. And so for them to hear that you can be so open and honest about, oh yeah, I have insecurity and it's low self-esteem that's pushing me forward, because they will look at you and think it impossible that you could possibly have low self-esteem, which I think is really, really good for people to see that never goes away. And one of the things that I've always thought was, I'm not going to call it a superpower, but something that I've been glad that I have for myself is my motives are always apparent to me even when they're ugly and petty. And yeah, I mean, there are times where like what's driving me for whatever reason is ugly, it's petty, it makes me feel worse about myself, whatever, but at least I have clarity on what it is.
Yeah, I wish I could say I always could see it. I don't think I can. I think it requires a lot of, I don't think 2 years ago I could have acknowledged what I can be much more brutally honest with myself about today.
What happened that made that?
I mean, I've always seen therapists. There's been very rare has there been a season in my life where I wasn't sort of searching for some sense of, why do I feel so tormented? And, one of them said the most insightful thing to me I've ever heard. Your entire life has been basically driven by three skills, three things that you do that you're really good at. And they're not good things, by the way, right? Emotional detachment, rage, and obsession. Wow. Those are like the only three tools. You are a guy that has a toolbox that has three tools, and those are the three tools. And she said, look, you've got a lot of good stuff out of those tools. There are a lot of people who get those three tools and they just end up in jail. Mm-hmm. So you've managed to, through a lot of luck, wind up not in jail, wind up as a quasi-successful human being, a contributor to society, a father, like you've done some good stuff. But she also said you're sort of at the end of your rope with those three tools. Like you can't get any more juice out of squeezing those things. There is no combination of emotional detachment, obsession, and rage that is going to produce anything of value. And you're actually now at the diminishing part of the curve. So now you're regressing. So you're gonna need new tools. And, so in many ways, I think that's what has allowed me to go back and say, okay, well, what is the impetus of that? Why are these things happening? Who do I want to be in 5 years, right? Because I can't fathom I can't fathom being any different in 5 days. So I have to think bigger. I have to think of like, okay, in 5 years, you want to be, it's sort of like what we talked about at the outset. If when you're 100, you want to be able to do these things, you can back out of that and say, this is what you have to be able to do when you're 70 or 60. And similarly, if in 5 years, when my kids are aged this, and this, I want to be this kind of a person. And right now, I'm not on a path to be anywhere near that. In fact, I'm on a path to be completely different, in a completely different place. Okay, so start backing out. The person who can do those things in 5 years has to be able to do what in a month? How would they react in this situation versus how do you always react in a situation? People like me who are very good at doing things where harder work produces better results, like when that's your playbook and you are now confronted with trying to do something where that playbook doesn't work, it is ego demoralizing, right? Like if the answer is just swim further, like all you have to do is just keep swimming. Don't stop swimming. I got it. That is my book, man. But if the answer is no, you now have to be able to control your emotions in a certain way. You now have to be able to, as you said, recognize in a moment when you have an emotional reaction what it's really about. Because it's never about what you think it's about. It's about something else. Can you stop yourself in the moment and recognize that? That is a new skill. And I'm a baby trying to learn that skill. And my old trick of just work harder, it fails. So in many senses, it's like the most intimidating thing I've ever tried to do, right?
What's your process in all this? Like, how are you actively getting better?
One is just showing up every day, right? So it's like the last week when it was the last time I spoke with one of these therapists, I just had a really miserable day. I mean, I just didn't want to talk to him at all. I was in a really, really bad mood. And so part of it, I guess, is you set yourself up around people who are never going to take your shit, right? So you have therapists. So for me, having these collection of people around me, it's like they absolutely, positively don't let me get away with anything, I guess part of it too is just having really patient people around you, because you're going to make a lot of mistakes in this process, right? So you have to, in my case, I feel very fortunate. I have a spouse who is, I would say more forgiving than probably she should be. She believes in the sort of like, this is what you could be in 5 years. This is the guy you can be. So when someone believes in that, they're much more willing to help you. When you fall, they'll pick you up as opposed to point out that you fell.
And do you have like a specific vision of yourself that you're building towards or chasing?
I mean, I do. And it's not a professional version of me. It's a personal version of me. If I could wave a magic wand, what kind of a husband, what kind of a father am I? And the reason I use those two as an example is it's unfortunately the people who are closest to me who always see the worst of me. And so most of what I think about is how do you show up for those people? Because if you can show up as the best version of you for those people, the trickle effect is everyone's going to be fine. Like you will be a great version of you with everybody. So it's less about how do you show up at the TSA check gate when the person's obnoxious. I don't worry about that much. Right. That's a relatively easy thing to control. But when you're taking out your problems on your kids or on your spouse, to me that's the stuff that's just gotta stop. And if you can get to that, to me that's the hill of the mountain. That's that's the hill when you climb that. Well, at that point, you're going to be treating everybody the way that they deserve to be treated, including yourself, by the way. I mean, as you probably know, those of us who are the biggest, sort of jerks to others are usually jerks to ourselves. You're quite aware of how hard you are on other people when they make mistakes. Do you realize how hard you are on yourself? Do you know what your self-talk is when you're making errors? And I started paying attention to it, and I was like, wow, that's harsh. That's very harsh that you think these things of yourself. Which again, it all ties back to this insecurity. And at the outset, I said, whatever, 5 years ago or 4 years ago, 90% of my bandwidth was on like how to not die, and today that's only 50% of my bandwidth. The other 50% is the whole physical stuff we talked about, and then it's this, right? It's this. What does an examined life mean, and is it a life worth living? Because I do think we suffer so much in our own heads. More than we suffer any other way. And I don't know the answer to that. Here's what I know. I know that that's way harder than reducing the risk of heart disease. I know that's way harder than, addressing that is way harder than fasting or doing all of these other things that are even non-pharmacologic interventions that I think can fix all those other things. And certainly for someone like me, it's harder than, exercising or being disciplined about all of these other things. And I suspect in part because it's less amenable to doing, right? The things that we do tend to be a little bit easier, but this is tough stuff. So I don't know. I mean, maybe part of the reason to want to live longer is to just give more runway to figure this out. Effectively, why would you want to live longer if you're unhappy? And that's such a obvious question, and yet I am amazed, absolutely amazed at how much I interact with people. Because remember, all I do is interact with people who want to live longer. That's my job. Everybody I'm talking to, everybody who wants to talk to me, always wants to talk about how to live longer, how to live better in some way. And yet, very rarely are they paying attention to this aspect of their life. What is their relationship like with themselves? How well, as you put it, do they understand themselves? What are their relationships with other people? How well are they able to regulate their emotions? How present are they? What is their sense of purpose? What is driving them? All these things. And if that house is in disarray, I would make the argument that living longer is a curse, not a blessing.
It's a bold statement.
But
So
push back on it. I mean, what's the definition of torture, right? Let's play a thought experiment. If I said to you, Tom, I'm going to grant you immortality in perfect health. So it's not going to be like Tithonius, where I let you live forever, but you age forever. That would be hell. No. I'm going to allow you to stay right like you are now. You're not going to get one more wrinkle on your face. You're never going to get a disease. Would you take it?
Yes.
I'm not going to give it to anybody else in your life.
Oh yeah, I would take that. I'm always shocked that other people, my wife included, wouldn't. But
Okay.
I would.
All right. So let's go one step further. I'm going to
Would
give
you?
it. No, I wouldn't.
That's so interesting. Do you know how many people you're going to watch die? Wait, I'm making the assumption that's what bothers you. Why wouldn't you take that?
Well, let's come back to me. I want to keep going with you for a minute.
Okay.
So now I'm going to give you a different experiment. We're going to do the same thing, but I'm going to put you on a desert island now.
Yep.
And I'm going to provide everything for you. So you're not going to have to worry about finding food. In fact, forget the desert island. I'm going to keep you in this beautiful house.
Yep.
And I'm going to somehow keep the lights on, and I'm going to somehow keep the food coming in, but there will be no other human on this planet for you to ever interact with, including your wife. Would you take that?
Can I kill myself?
No.
So I have to live forever like that.
Yes.
That's the first one where just what I know about the human psyche breaking in isolation, it would be ill-advised, though. God, I would want to. If you'd let me kill myself at any point, I would take it. But if I can't, it's too dangerous.
No, of course you wouldn't take it, right? I mean,
It's not in the course for me. That is not self-evident. And if I didn't understand what happens to the human psyche when it's isolated, in my life, where I have been isolated for extended periods of time, I have experienced no suffering whatsoever. I just know
I don't
that
disagree with
taken
that, but
to
I
an
think the
extreme-
question is, what's the longest period of time you've been isolated?
Yeah, exactly.
And what does
Call it
isolated
a
truly mean?
week.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if I have input, like if you let me keep the lights on and I could have entertainment, I've thought a lot about this. Like, how much would that help? But like, you saw the movie Castaway?
Yeah.
Okay, so if I had any glimmer of hope that I could get off that island, I would want to be alive. I would want to try and
Yes,
try.
but that's
and
a
try
totally
and
different
try.
story, right?
Yeah.
So this is.
But what I'm saying is, even the hope that I could one day reconnect.
I'm telling you, there's no hope. I'm
Yeah,
telling
so
you
then I would not.
that I'm
It's
going to
the-
let you live
I wouldn't take that.
indefinitely in this house all by yourself.
Yep.
Okay, so that's just an extreme example of one dimension of emotional health, which is connection to others. And I'm telling you that given everything to excess. Oh, and by the way, I'll even sweeten the deal, Tom. I'll give you all the money in the world, and you can buy whatever you want.
Wow.
Right.
Now buy what?
Oh, you could buy yachts, art, whatever you want. We're going to have robots that do everything for you, that make everything, and you can't interact with these robots.
I was going to say,
no,
you complicated the matter.
The robots are not. They're not going to supplant humans.
So there's everything I could ever want except for human.
You can have all the
interaction.
cars, all the yachts,
Yep,
all
I know
the
better.
whatever.
Yep.
You're not going to do it. If you really stop to think about it, you're not going to do it. Because with no connection to another person, it's a meaningless life.
Yep.
So we could do the same sort of exercise going through all of these different elements of emotional health. And I think if people are really being brutally honest with themselves, they'll realize that if your wife hates you, if your kids hate you, if if people around you don't feel good about you and you don't feel good about yourself, and you're not, you don't have a sense of why you're doing what you're doing, I think it's a tough way to live.
So do you think that people asking that question of how to live longer is in some ways not the wrong question, but it's just so incomplete that you need to address the emotional side?
I think it's a very understandable question. I can't speak to others, but I certainly, through my own experience, can understand why one would ask that question and why it's something you would want to grasp onto. I mean, I think that for most of us, the thought of not existing is a little, if not frightening, certainly very uncomfortable. Non-existence is very difficult.
Only on the backside. So we all know what non-existence is like. Try to imagine what you were like before you were born. So it's possible I'm deluding myself. It's also possible that I really just see this slightly differently. So I have absolutely no fear of not existing. If yeah, the thought of just not waking up tomorrow only gives me anxiety around, ooh, did I make sure that I sorted things out for my wife? Like, is she going to be okay? Like the thought of something bad happening to her, I don't like that. Knowing that I'm about to die would change my frame of reference so radically that it would make me immediately behave differently. So definitely a huge part of the way that I behave is predicated on that I have more time. I try to operate knowing that it's certainly not guaranteed. I could have an aneurysm and keel over and die before the end of this podcast. I'm very aware of that. The reason that this feels so important to me, and the reason that I was so glad you included it in the book, is that I think the only thing ultimately that matters is how you feel about yourself when you're by yourself. And if you have earned your own respect, I think that's hugely important. I just found it very intriguing that not a lot of people are going to cover that topic in your book. And I was wondering if it's just that, like, hey, make sure that it's worth fighting this hard to stay alive, and make sure that you're not just driven by the animal instinct to fight or flight. And basically you have a vision of your mortality that you're running away from, but you're never like figuring out why you live. Or is there also a sense of, if you're in that state where you're very stressed out, you're prone to anger, whatever the case may be, you're also shortening your life?
Yeah, I think it's both, Tom. And I think that a lot of people are self-sabotaging without understanding why. So we have a lot of agency over living longer. I mean, if there's one thing I hope someone takes away from this book, it's how malleable their lifespan is and how malleable their health span is. But you have to do things to get that. As you pointed out at the beginning of the discussion, there is no easy way to do this. There's not a pill or a specific workout or a superfood or a supplement or whatever that's going to make all of this easy. It's a lot of stuff that has to be done over a relatively long period of time. And your ability to do that is highly predicated on your relationship with yourself. And so, having sort of poor sleep habits, poor nutrition habits, poor exercise habits, on some level has a component or a root in your emotional health. And that's not true for everybody, but it is true for a lot of people. I see this constantly in my patients, right? I see patients whose own story, whose own narrative is partly an impediment to their actions. And so they're suffering twice. They're suffering in that their failure to take actions, or their actions that they're taking, for example, drinking too much, are going to actually shorten their life, but they're also going to decrease the joy of their life and the harmony of their life for whatever period they have.
So let's say that we do everything right. Let's say we've got meaning and purpose. We have dealt with our emotional difficulties. We have identified, and this is actually something that's really important that I took away from the book. You really have to figure out what of the horsemen is coming for you. What agent of death from a family history, genetic makeup, lifestyle, all of that, which one is most likely to come and get you? I think that's very important. It might be worth actually recapping who the horsemen are. We've touched on them, I think all of them, but we didn't name them as like, these are the horsemen. Might be worth doing that. But so you're doing all this. How long can we live? Like, is it really like, we're already there? It's like 122 and I hope you get there, my friend, and follow the book and you'll get to 122. Or can we actually push this farther?
Based on what we have today, I don't see us exceeding the human record for longevity. I think to go beyond that would require a technological breakthrough. So I would never represent that, doing everything to the max with respect to perfect nutrition, perfect exercise, perfect management of the horsemen through all means necessary, that's going to get someone to exceed that level. My thinking of this is that, we might have 10 years of stretch which is a huge amount if you really stop to think about it, right? If your life expectancy is 82 and you make it to 92 instead.
And their quality.
Exactly. And that's the point, right? Where I'm really confident we have the capacity to change it is on quality. And, I said to you, everybody comes to me on some level and they want to talk about longevity. But when I really probe them, what they really mean is health span. They don't care as much about how long they live. They really care about the quality at the end of their life.
I care about both, to be really honest.
As do I.
Health span would be, if I don't have that, it's all meaningless. I totally agree with you. I would pay almost any price to live longer. And so for instance, the question that you asked, like, I would, even if there was an apocalypse, as long as there were some other people, even if it killed everyone I knew and loved, which would be brutal, man. Like I am into my wife in a way most people just are not into their significant other. I can tell by talking to them. And even that, I would, if a meteorite hit and it was like, your wife is going to die, but you can live, I'd be like, yeah, I want to live. So my wife wouldn't though. She's like, if you die, I'm going. That's so interesting. I can't wrap my head around that.
It depends on my kids, but yes, if my wife and kids were not on this earth, I wouldn't want to be on this earth.
But what would happen if, God forbid, Peter, God forbid, I don't have kids partly because I am so afraid of how devastating it would be if they died. But if they died, would you want to die?
Again, I hope I never have to contemplate that. But if I lost all of my kids, yeah, I'd have a hard time probably wanting to go on.
Wow. I get it, man. Look, I have seen people go through it. It is an unbearable thing that I can't believe life asks of anybody. But despite knowing how bad that hurts, and I would not want to go through it, I don't know, man. And look, of course, I might get so rocked. I'm just saying, here from an emotional sobriety standpoint, where it is just a thought exercise, I don't understand people's response to be like, yeah, just take me out.
But let's go back to, I think, what's the more germane point, which is you want quality of life and length of life. I hope what comes across really clearly in the book is those are not mutually exclusive. And what I really would like people to understand is if you pursue them both, you get them both. In fact, if you just focus on health span, if you just focus on preserving cognition, having the most physically robust body possible as you age, and pursuing emotional health, you are guaranteed to get lifespan benefits as well.
Okay, so talk to me about the horsemen. Let's name them.
So there's 4. 3 of them basically account for the majority of death in the first world. One of them directly doesn't account for that much of the death, but indirectly probably accounts for the most of it. In other words, it's the amplifier of the other 3. So the big 3 are the diseases of atherosclerosis, so heart disease and stroke. Second one is cancer. Third one is neurodegenerative diseases, inclusive of all dementias. So that includes Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, Lewy body, dementia, vascular dementia, etc. So those 3 really, they show up a lot on death certificates. They kill a lot of people. The fourth one is more of a spectrum. It's not a single disease, but it's the spectrum that goes from hyperinsulinemia to insulin resistance, fatty liver disease, all that metabolic stuff we talked about, all the way out to type 2 diabetes. And again, not a huge number of people's death certificate says NAFLD, type 2 diabetes. A little bit, but not staggering. But when you're on that spectrum, the further you get towards the type 2 diabetes side of that spectrum, you're just doubling your risk, essentially, of all the other 3 horsemen.
Do you think that metabolic disease is causative? Like, is basically every non-traumatic death, is it downstream of
No,
that?
it's neither necessary nor sufficient, but it is causative. So you can have causality without necessity and sufficiency. So let's take an obvious example: smoking. Is smoking causatively related to lung cancer? 100%. Like, meaning there is a causal relationship between smoking and lung cancer, but 15% of people who get lung cancer never smoked. I don't know the number, but many people who smoke don't get lung cancer. So similarly, metabolic disease is 100% causally related to the other diseases, but not everybody who gets not everybody who's metabolically ill is going to necessarily succumb to those diseases. You could die of something else. And not everybody who succumbs to those diseases had metabolic disease.
Okay, that's really interesting. There's at least one example you give in the book. I'm not sure where you put your own story, but you scored a 6 on the calcification scale, very young, 30-something. And then Anahat O'Connor, who we bizarrely both know, you know him way, 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 way better than I do, but I had the good fortune of meeting him. He scored like 126 or some ridiculous thing. So is that the kind of example where you guys were both relatively healthy, but have this, genetic predisposition?
Well, totally different issues. I mean, Anahad, as I write about in the book, had, unbeknownst to him, a very elevated LP(a), which is genetic, and he was otherwise exceptionally healthy, and is, to this day, exceptionally healthy, but had this genetic issue that was driving, rapidly advancing heart disease, and luckily... was caught really early. I mean, 125 or whatever, his calcium score was pretty darn advanced, but to be able to catch that at such a young age is going to make an enormous difference in course correction. So had he not had that calcium scan done and acted on it, there's virtually no question in my mind he would have died prematurely.
Yeah, so I was going to ask, so if that isn't a driver or isn't being driven by his diet, is it purely just genetic luck of the draw?
Yes.
Okay, so in the book you tell a story of somebody that came to you, they had just the worst deck of cards or hand of cards that you could be dealt around cognitive decline.
Well, as in they had the worst, I mean, they didn't have the worst, fortunately. They had a very bad hand dealt to them vis-a-vis the risk of Alzheimer's disease.
So how do you, if you get a rough deck hand, I don't know why I keep calling it deck, you get a rough hand like that, what do you do?
You start acting as early as possible to mitigate the risks. So we know we have a really good sense of things that people can do to reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease. And in this particular woman's case, I call her Stephanie, that's not her real name. We undertake a number of things with respect to sleep, stress, nutrition, exercise, supplements that we know are correcting certain deficiencies, such as elevated homocysteine levels. And unfortunately, in her case, fortunately, because she's so young, but unfortunately for many people, we don't have pharmacologic strategies yet. So we're just, I think, on the precipice of sort of some precision medicine ideas. So for example, in our high-risk patients who have this gene, the ApoE4 gene, we are using a new test called the C2N test that measures plasma amyloid. And we're using plasma amyloid as a biomarker for the first time now to track interventions. So in other words, we're using drugs, exercise, nutrition, etc., to try to lower plasma amyloid in high-risk people.
Talk to me about drugs. Like, this is one thing. Statins comes up a couple times in the book. The only drug I take is an antihistamine. And I would stop doing that if I could figure out what it is, either in my diet or my environment, that's giving me the allergies. But I've had it across like 7 different places that I've lived, different states. Like, I mean, it just doesn't seem to matter. I've had wildly varying diets, doesn't seem to impact it. Anyway, so I take an allergy medication, and then I'll sometimes supplement vitamin D. But other than that, I just have a real hesitation to take any supplementation whatsoever. But you don't seem to have the same fear I have of an isolated compound. So you get people on statins if they have early signs of heart disease?
Not necessarily. I mean, when it comes to managing ApoB, which is the thing we're trying to manage on the lipid side, we have a lot of classes of drugs. Statins are one class of drug. That's one way to lower ApoB, is to use a statin. Statins also happen to have the most side effects of any class of drug that lower lipids. In fact, all the other classes of drugs that lower lipids have no side effects. statins really have the worst side effects by far. So you might say, well, why do we even tolerate statins? Like, why would we even use them? We use them because we have the most data for them. They are very efficacious, though not the most efficacious. And they may have some other benefits that go beyond their ApoB lowering benefits. So all of that has to kind of be weighed. And you have to weigh that against the downside of statins, which are that a non-trivial subset of people have at least one of two problems in the presence of a statin. One, they get muscle soreness. The other problem is, paradoxically, their glucose metabolism goes to hell. Not entirely clear why, by the way, but we see dysregulated glucose metabolism in a small subset of patients on statins. And again, we see in a small subset of those patients about 5% muscle soreness. So if we have those symptoms or signs in a person on a statin, and we've chosen a statin as part of the solution in this lipid-lowering campaign, we just discontinue it.
And
it reverses like that.
But when you prescribe somebody a drug, do you do that only when it's like they cannot address this via diet and exercise?
Yeah, it depends. So it depends on several things. So exercise has very little bearing on lipids. It has no clinically meaningful benefit on lipids. Has a much better clinical benefit on metabolic health and blood pressure, which are also very important in controlling heart disease. So we care a lot about exercise because we want to control those other things that drive heart disease. The big three, by the way, are smoking, high blood pressure, and high ApoB. So we're trying to do all of this in concurrent fashion as opposed to just, playing whack-a-mole on one thing. But nutrition has a relatively minor role outside of extremes at controlling ApoB. Once you get a person sort of insulin sensitive, and once you've normalized their triglycerides, unless you're willing to go on profound fat restriction, it's very difficult to get ApoB in the levels that we deem appropriate for true prevention.
Would you rather put them on profound fat reduction or?
Generally not, because it usually comes at such a high cost.
What's that cost?
Usually they end up getting insulin resistant because you're now putting them on a very high carbohydrate diet, and they're usually protein malnourished.
Why would that be true? So
it just is a function of what they're eating.
So for 2 years, I used to be 60 pounds heavier. To lose the 60 pounds, I basically just ate chicken breast and broccoli. And while not fun, because I was also calorically restricting so hard, it was fine.
Yeah. And if that works,
would that be preference, though, over a drug?
Here's what I say. No. The answer is no. What I say is diet is a way harder problem to get right than drug. So let's get the diet right first. Let's come up with the diet that works best for your metabolic health, your muscle mass, your sort of fat distribution, and your sanity. Diet is really hard to get right. Maybe not for you. You're kind of a highly disciplined person. But for most of us, we want to make sure that we can put you on a diet that you're able to stay with for the long haul. We're not compromising muscle mass. We're not compromising metabolic health. So if that diet also happens to produce very low ApoB because it's highly restrictive in fat, fantastic. Stay the course. In my clinical experience, taking care of lots of patients, that's not the case for most people. For most people, the diet that produces optimal muscle mass, really good metabolic health, and is something that they can tolerate for a long period of time, it's not sufficiently reduced in fat enough to have a meaningful impact on their lipids. And therefore, if we want to get ApoB low enough to really get into major prevention territory, we're going to need a drug.
Okay. I'm not sure if it's more enlightening to find out what stack of drugs, supplements you take, or if based on horsemen that is likely to kill you, I have people on these. But I am curious, what do you take? Are you on rapamycin, metformin, anything like that?
I do take rapamycin. I do not take metformin. I do take a lipid-lowering drug. I take 2 lipid-lowering drugs. So one of them is called Repatha. It's a PCSK9 inhibitor. So it's an injectable drug that prevents the degradation of LDL receptors on the liver. So
That's specific.
very specific. So it's a very clean drug, has no side effects, works incredibly well. It's the most potent lipid-lowering drug we have.
Did you have a genetic predilection to something that made this necessary?
I mean, I just only in that I have a genetic predilection to heart disease. My family history is abysmal for heart disease. So, once that came into focus for me, I was very clear that I was going to do anything and everything to at least take that off the table.
Right.
And that basically means not smoking, not an issue, having low to normal blood pressure, fortunately not an issue, and having physiologic concentrations of ApoB, meaning lowering my ApoB to the level of a child.
Okay. And are you able to get to that, or is that what this injectable is for?
I use these drugs to do that.
Got it. Does rapamycin help with that?
No.
So what's rapamycin about? Explain what it does to people.
Well, I think that's a bit of a TBD right now. I mean, we know what it does in the on-label use. So on-label use of rapamycin, which is, taking kind of a medium dose every single day, is an immunosuppressive dose. And that's how rapamycin was approved in 1999 by the FDA for use in patients with solid organ transplants. So when you have an organ of somebody else put into you, your immune system naturally wants to destroy that organ. So patients who get organ transplants, kidneys or livers or hearts or things like that, they have to be on a cocktail of drugs to suppress their immune system, specifically their T cells, which are the cells that would normally be going after viruses, but now they're going after the organ. So that's nothing to really do with how we're thinking about rapamycin, as we're thinking about rapamycin through the lens of what's called geroprotection, which means you don't really have a very specific disease you're treating. You're more broadly targeting the process of aging at the cellular level. And there, based on a lot of animal data that's very compelling, it appears that rapamycin does indeed provide geroprotection. But it's very unclear as to how to dose it to get that. And how you dose it in a mouse probably isn't how you should dose it in a human. But we don't really know.
So if we don't know,
why am I doing it?
Yes.
Yeah, I guess I'm steeped reasonably well in the literature, and I have a strong enough conviction that the way we're dosing it for this purpose has a much higher probability of being valuable than not. But I'm going to be very quick to abort in the presence of new information. Just as
new information that you see in the literature, in your blood, both?
All of the above. New studies coming out. There's a very important study coming out in 3 years called the Dog Aging Project, I believe it's called.
Yeah, Matt Kaeberlein.
Matt Kaeberlein, yep.
I had him on the show.
Yeah,
So very interesting. So if I remember right from talking to him, basically we're trying to get out of mTOR more or less, which is my big fear with my diet, because I eat so much. I mean, so much has changed in my mind since reading your book, but I eat so much protein, animal protein specifically. I imagine I'm in mTOR all the time. And so is tempting to try rapamycin, but is that what's really going on?
not really. I mean, well, yes, rapamycin is an inhibitor of mTOR. That's how the drug works. But it's not. When you eat protein, the activation of mTOR is relatively short. So,
but if you're eating it all the time, wouldn't you then presumably just constantly be stoking that fire?
Not necessarily. I mean, even if you eat like I do, which is no intermittent fasting, there's still 14 hours a day I'm eating nothing, right? So, and again, amino acids do not stick around very long in circulation. So, you know, they're coming on, they're stimulating mTOR, and then they're gone. If rapamycin's benefit is through mTOR inhibition specifically, it's probably more through the inhibition of chronic elevation.
Okay.
And who knows? There may be tissue specificity. It may be more about what it's doing in one part of, in one tissue versus another. It might not be in the muscle. It might be in the liver. There are a lot of unanswered questions here, which is why I think the work Matt is doing is really important. It's very difficult to imagine immortality when you untether and uncouple the not dying part with the preservation of health span, so specifically cognitive performance and physical performance. And I think more about those things now than I probably ever have before. I think a lot about sort of the physical stuff. So what does it really mean to be 100 but function like a well-to-do 50 to 60-year-old? And even if you're alive, how happy would you be? I mean, it would be, I think for many people it would be quite frustrating. Or, you know, if you had grandkids or great-grandkids and you couldn't play with them, or you couldn't tie your shoe. I mean, we actually use tying a shoe as one of the metrics to evaluate sort of flexibility and certain physical performance. So most people our age don't think of tying their shoe as a physical performance.
Right.
And yet when you would start to lose those things, I think you'd have a radically different view of, you know, what am I doing? But how do you get there and look, perform, and feel like the way we imagine a 60-year-old today, a fit 60-year-old? Because I know some 60-year-olds that are just amazing, right? So how do you take that to 100?
And what would have to happen for us? Like, what do we really need to figure out? Is this a flexibility problem, joints burning out problem, ATP problem? Like, what's the big?
Good question. So far, my exploration to this topic has suggested a couple of things. So one is we do tend to disproportionately load joints over muscles. So in an ideal world, you would want to figure out a way to exercise where you can maximally load the muscle while minimally loading the joint. So there is a lot of joint failure that becomes problematic. I mean, and I'm separating the obvious, which is there's just too many people who aren't exercising enough or correctly at all.
Right.
And so they're just sort of withering away. But if you come at this through the lens of, okay, well, what if we're dealing with a subset of people who are committed to figuring out how can they exercise best? In many ways, it's just a lack of specificity, right? So most people who exercise can't actually tell you why they're doing what they're doing. The 99.9% of us who don't get paid to play a sport and who aren't even really competing at a serious level outside of the professional ranks, I don't think we know what our sport is. And I think the sport should be being the most kick-ass 100-year-old that ever lived. So what would that look like? Like, what does it mean to be the most kick-ass 100-year-old? And I think you have to then reverse engineer all of the things one should be able to do. So a kick-ass 100-year-old should be able to, I don't know, I'm making this up because I haven't fully codified this yet, but they should certainly be able to carry 2 25-pound bags from a grocery store. They should be able to lift a 30 or 40-pound bag over their head to put it in a, you know, compartment of an airport or of an airplane. They should be able to have a, you know, 25-pound little terror run at them, you know, i.e. their great-grandchild, or dip down into a squat and grab them and pick them up. They should be able to jump down on the floor and play with cars or dolls and stand up without assistance. And if you start to map out the 25 or 35 things, that becomes a new decathlon. So instead of saying the decathlon is running this distance, jumping this far, swimming this far, it's like, great, those are kind of arbitrary. Now we're going to come up with like real world things that you have to be able to do when you're 100 if you want to live what I would describe as potentially a more fulfilling physical life, to enjoy the fruits of having not died by that point in your life.
All right, so how do we build towards that? I love this, by the way. Like I always tell people, I want to live forever. I'm well aware that as of right now, I'm going to die. So my thing is, how do we stay alive long enough to give time for these step function breakthroughs to happen? So what do I do? Like, what are the things that I train, or the hormone replacement therapies that I need to go? What do I need to watch? What are those things that I should be doing?
Taking a step back, I would say 3 years ago, 80 to 90% of my energy went into how to not die, which basically,
the defensive strategy.
Yeah, which is tantamount to how do you delay the onset of chronic disease. So the mathematical equivalent of longevity from a lifespan perspective is creating a phase shift in disease onset. If you want to live to 100, it basically means you have to delay the onset by about 2 decades of every major chronic disease.
Wow.
So it doesn't mean you can't get cancer or heart disease or any of these other things, but you better figure out a way to get them 20 years after the average person gets them. I would say now that occupies 50% of my brainwave energy, whatever, and much more time goes into 2 other things, which is how to minimize suffering, which is kind of an emotional problem,
Wow.
and then how to be this kick-ass 100-year-old. So to the latter, the model I have in my mind is that of sort of Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee sort of looked at each and every discipline of martial arts, including boxing and wrestling and things like that, and said, let me extract from each of these disciplines that which I believe is useful, discard those that I think are useless, and create a perfect fighting form that is truly geared towards self-defense. So it is not a sport. There is no tournament. There is no rank. There is no belt. There is no sensei. It is, can you handle yourself in a life or death situation?
My wife Lisa struggled profoundly with her gut health and experienced debilitating stomach pain. So I focused my energy on learning everything I could about the human gut. Viome is on the cutting edge of this growing area of study with their at-home gut intelligence test. Just 2 to 3 weeks after sending in your sample, you can see your results on 20 integrative health tests that measure your inflammatory activity, metabolic fitness, and the health of your gut lining. As a special offer to my viewers, Viome is offering $110 off your test. Just go to tryviome.com/impact and use code IMPACT to get the $110 off.
If I go to a yoga class, or if I do a Pilates class, invariably there's something in there that I think is really valuable. And truthfully, there's a bunch of stuff that I'm like, I don't need this. This is just, if I had infinite time, this would be fine to do, but I don't have infinite time. So now you apply a constraint to the problem, which is not only do you want to be sort of the best 100-year-old imaginable, what if you're only willing to spend 10 to 12 hours a week preparing for that? And so you say, okay, well, so there's a new sport, which we define some of the parameters of. That's your new Olympics, and that Olympics is 50 years from now. How will you train for it if you're only willing to spend 10 to 12 hours a week training for it? Well, my guess is you will take a lot of things from various disciplines, discard a lot of things, and sort of have to build a very bespoke routine around it that will involve the maintenance of muscle mass, joint integrity, flexibility, functional movement, balance, things that we don't even really think about anymore. How many times does someone who's 90 fall because they've lost their balance? And it's that fall that ultimately leads to their demise.
How much of that, the balance thing, do you think is neurological, and how much is physical? They're just not doing enough physical shit to figure out, to maintain that.
My guess is it's probably both. There's a stability issue that starts to go away as you age. Also, the consequences of a fall become much more apparent. So it's probably not just the case that someone who's older falls that much more. It might be that the severity of the injury becomes so much more severe. So right now, if I were walking here and I tripped on that stair and fell, you know, maybe on a really, really bad day, I break my wrist.
Right.
But most likely nothing happens. In 50 years, if I do that same thing, the probability that something bad happens is going to be much greater.
Yeah.
But that said, I already can tell my balance is not what it was when I was 20, when I was 15. I mean, I used to be able to do this exercise when I was 15, where I would do with blindfolded, I could do a single leg squat with the non-squatting leg straight out in front of me. So I could go all the way to the floor and all the way up, arms crossed, blindfolded. I could do 20 each leg. I can't do that once today with my eyes open. So admittedly, I'm nowhere near as strong as I used to be, so there's a strength component, but I also just clearly lack the balance. And so the question is, now maybe that activity is a bit over, you know, that's just unnecessary. And again, I don't know what the answer is. I don't know if this means I need to get out there and practice on a tightrope or something like, but there's something that needs to be done. So every time I do some sort of really well thought out workout, I find myself thinking, God, like some percentage of this is so essential. All of those things need to be put into this new discipline, this new sport, which is called, for lack of a better word, being a kick-ass 100-year-old.
I definitely like the sport. Now, one thing that I found really interesting is, so people complain a lot about lower back pain, talking about unnecessarily loading the lumbar. I've found that if I don't deadlift, my lower back hurts, not if I do deadlift. Now, some of that's probably that I have decent form. It's certainly not exceptional, but I have decent form. I know how to avoid injury. But it is so weird to me that doing nothing will end up causing me pain in my lower back. But if I'm religious and I'm doing it, you know, once or twice a week, every week, I feel bulletproof.
The advantage of deadlifting and squatting to me is they reveal all of your errors in movement, right? Like they are, I don't know how to describe it, but you can't hide from those movements. Like you can't take bad form into those things and not get revealed.
Right.
So I like that. The question is it an unnecessary risk, right? Am I one bad deadlift away from doing something stupid? and again, I'm as empathetic and in love with those movements as anybody, but I also don't know if I need to do that to be the best version of myself as a 100-year-old. So the stuff I've been doing for the last 4 to 6 weeks, I basically haven't had more than 155 pounds on my back in 6 weeks. But by changing the form of what I'm doing and making everything a single leg movement, so a lot of curtsy squats, lateral lunges, incredibly strict lunges where you are so specifically loading the front leg glute, I gotta tell you, and then doing a lot of single leg body weight squats, but with meticulous form so that I'm fully loading the glute, not overloading the quad, which is my absolute common mistake. By doing these things, I don't feel like I've lost a step, but I absolutely know I'm loading myself less. Now the question is, does that matter? And I don't think I know the answer yet. So unfortunately, I feel like I'm still too early in this process to know what the finish line looks like. And there's other problems that we haven't even touched on, right? Like what VO2 max and what aerobic base are necessary as a minimum threshold?
Yeah, talk to me about that, because I hate cardio. But it's one of those, if I have to have the kind of longevity, then so be it.
And the term cardio is itself so confusing, right? Because even if you think of what is VO2 max, I mean, most people think, well, that's really a heart-lung issue. It's actually not. It's more of a muscle issue.
Interesting.
Because that's where the bottleneck is not in how much oxygen can you get in your lungs. The bottleneck is how much can your muscles utilize. So when you look at, the winner of the Tour de France, or the gold medalist in cross-country skiing, or the person who wins the Boston Marathon, like when you look at the most extreme endurance athletes who have these very high VO2 maxes, what's unique about these people is their muscles, which is counterintuitive because they're usually very slender individuals, but their muscles are so efficient at aerobic metabolism that they are able to extract so much oxygen out of blood. When you and I, are at our maximum capacity, we're still breathing out, 80% of the oxygen we breathed in. So it's really not a gas exchange problem, it's a muscle problem. That said, VO2 max is a very specific energy system that probably gets a little more credit than it deserves. So
what are the alternatives?
Well, so VO2 max is really, as its name suggests, so the definition is, what is your maximal extraction or utilization of oxygen? The way to experience what that is go out and run for 4 minutes as hard as you possibly can. Yeah. That is that energy system. But there are other energy systems, right? In cycling, we talk about 7 different energy systems. But again, you can really simplify this and say, there's sort of the energy system we're in right now, which is the smoking and joking energy system. At the far end of the spectrum is this neuromuscular area where you're basically doing the most explosive movement imaginable for 10 to 15 seconds. And I suspect that for each of those energy systems, there's a minimum threshold that you'd want to be above as you age. So ways that you could test that would be, even someone our age probably knows if you carry 2 bags of groceries up 4 flights of stairs, most people are feeling that. Right. Very few people get to the top of that 4th. I know that because that's my apartment's on the 4th floor. So like in New York, I'm always I'm always paying attention to what will happen when the day comes that this is not pleasant.
Right.
Like when I'm deciding I have to take the elevator up these 4 flights of stairs. And so if that becomes the minimum threshold, then you want to be there at 100, then you need to be there at 60, and you need to be there at 50, and you need to be there at 40. And so I think part of it is just defining those things, and that determines then what's the level of training you need to do. But I do think in this current environment of everybody loving high intensity interval training, which I love just as much as the next person, that's really only training one energy system. And I think if you ignore these other energy systems, you're sort of not fully optimizing around your performance. Translating that to this new sport, this 100-year-old kick-ass sport, I think it's just going to require a little more thought. I'm talking to orthopedic surgeons and saying, okay, talk to me about the injuries that are killing people. Because there's 2 types of orthopedic injuries that kill people. There's fast death and slow death. So fast death is patient falls and within a day or so is dead from whatever the injury was. So they, break their femur, they have a fat embolism, they're dead, or they fall and they hit their head and they, have a cerebrovascular accident and they're dead. But then there's also the slow deaths, right? And these ones are, to me, far less talked about, but in many ways more tragic. So one of my closest friends, his father died recently, 89 years old, complications of Alzheimer's disease. He'd been diagnosed 8 months before he died. So in some senses, you could say, well, the good news is he and his family were spared a lot of suffering because, he was diagnosed in January, he died in August. But when I went home for the funeral, I was sort of struck by how difficult it had been for him since he was 81. The two things he loved most in life, which were golf and tending to his yard, he couldn't do because of more chronic orthopedic injuries. So he spent the last decade of his life kind of watching TV. And to me, that's the thing we have to be able to avoid. And, for me, I don't know what it's going to be when I'm 100, but I know that today, if I had to start saying, if someone said, well, you can't drive a race car and you can't shoot a bow and arrow and you can't lift weights, it doesn't matter how heavy it is, right? But you can't do these movements, or you can't lay on the floor to play. If I had to give those things up, I'm not sure how much I'd want to kick around. And so talking to these orthopedic surgeons is giving me a real insight into where those failures are coming from. And the single most important insight I've gained from them is something you alluded to at the outset, which is just joint overload. So much of what we do is, even while trying to be good, meaning trying to exercise and do these things, is just disproportionately taking on risk. So I'll give you one silly example, right? A military press. Is there a time and a place for a military press? Absolutely. Does it have any role in my life? Absolutely not. Right? Why not? First of all, I don't need to load my spine in that way. And if I could get 80% of the benefit that I get out of a military press by doing loaded activities below my shoulder line, below my neck, and using more static loaded movements above, and that gives me 80% of the benefit at 20% of the risk, that's exactly the kind of compromise I'm willing to make. And yet I don't think we're applying that level of risk reward to how we exercise.
Cancer, I don't know if people are more afraid of dementia or cancer, but both of those are pretty terrifying in terms of ways to go out. With cancer, I forget how long the war on cancer, we've made precious little progress. Are we barking up the wrong tree? Like what is it that either makes that so hard? Like if we know what it is, why is it so hard to deal with? And if we don't know what it is, why do you think that's evaded our eye for so long?
Well, it's a really good question. You're right that we have made scant progress in the most important metric of cancer, which is overall survival. So if you think about it, for everybody who gets cancer, we should be asking the question, how likely is it that they will not die of the cancer that they just got? Another way to think about that is, how likely are they to be alive in 10 years? If you're alive in 10 years after getting cancer, that cancer is unlikely to be the thing that kills you. And by that metric, we've only made about a 5 to 8% improvement in 50 plus years.
Whoa.
And that improvement has been largely in some very specific cancers. So that's not like across the board, we've gotten a bit better. It's like, no, we got a lot better in a couple of cancers, namely leukemias and certain lymphomas, a couple of other esoteric cancers like testicular cancer. And aside from that, we haven't really gotten better. Now, very recently, there's some exciting news that does seem more applicable to a slightly broader array of cancers, which is a form of therapy called immunotherapy. So unleashing the immune system to fight some solid organ tumors has also proved to be, and some leukemias and lymphomas, has proved to be quite promising, but we still haven't figured out a way to unleash that against every cancer. Even though in theory it should work, right? Every cancer should have at least some mutations on it that the immune system could recognize as non-self. And we know for certain that 80% of them do. In fact, 80% of cancers, solid organ cancers, so these are the ones that are killing the majority of people, right? So breast cancer, prostate cancer, lung cancer, colon cancer, et cetera. 80% of those cancers have what are called novel neoantigens on them, meaning they have antigens on them that are novel to the cancer and recognizable by the host's own immune system. The problem is there aren't enough T cells to recognize it to mount a sufficient immune response. So the real challenge of cancer therapy today, in my view, is going to be enhancing that problem, that process rather. In other words, I think most of the attention on cancer should be on how do we create more reactive antigens in cancer, and how do we enhance and extend the longevity of T cells to attract that. So I'm actually surprisingly more optimistic now about this than I was even when I started writing the book, because of what I'm seeing with a class of drugs called checkpoint inhibitors, and also for what I'm seeing with interesting clinical trials where we're seeing the pairing of checkpoint inhibitors, which are immune modulators, and conventional chemotherapy drugs, which take tumors that are not previously susceptible to this immune modulation, but then create mutations that then make them susceptible. Really clever and cool stuff. I think I write about a couple of examples of that in the cancer chapter. So it's easy to be sort of pessimistic about cancer because of how poorly it has gone for the past 50 years. But I think the next 10 years look a lot better than the last 50.
Because of things that are already in motion?
Yeah, because of these processes that are in motion.
So if you got diagnosed with cancer, what would be like step number one? What kind of cancer is it? Is it one that responds to immunotherapy? Is there like a protocol that you would walk down?
No, it would be entirely dependent on what the cancer was. But, so that gets to kind of step two of my thinking on cancer, which is the unequivocal, unambiguous understanding that your odds for treating cancer go down the more cancer cells you have in your body.
So detecting it sooner. In the book, you talk about for your patients, you lower the age of colonoscopy.
We do everything much more aggressively. So we're doing colonoscopy much earlier, much more frequently.
How often would you do a colonoscopy?
Oh, it depends on the individual. I mean, in me, I do it every 3 years.
Really?
Yeah. And then I do stool-based testing in between.
What do you check for on the stool?
You're looking for fecal DNA. So you're looking for DNA of the colon cancer. Yeah.
Interesting. It has its own DNA? What are we looking for?
Yeah, you're looking for the DNA that's shedding from a tumor.
Tumors have DNA other than it's not my own DNA?
It is your own, but it's mutated. I mean, by definition, cancer is a genetic disease, right? So cancer, by definition, has mutations that render it different from the host cell.
In a way that's predictable?
Yeah, that's
like we know what breaks in DNA.
Well,
or
we know.
mutations
Yeah,
into.
we know we're sampling what's normal because we see the abundance of that, and then we're looking at what's different.
Is there
that.
anything abnormal?
Yeah.
Very.
And that's what a liquid
Jesus.
biopsy
you
is doing.
How would you do that? Like the sequencing of that sounds like a nightmare.
Not anymore. I mean,
You can sift through that many
Oh
samples.
my God! Next generation sequencing can do this stuff like it's simple.
How many sequences would you have to do in a single fecal sample to figure out if there's one? Like, is it 1,000, 100, 10?
I think maybe a better question is what's the frequency of abnormal cells that can be detected in the presence of normal, and that's a good question. I don't know in fecal. I don't know in the fecal test. I know in the blood test it could be 1 in a million.
Do you guys, speaking of feces, do you guys look at the microbiome at all?
No.
Really? What?
Don't know what to do with it yet. Nobody knows what to do with it. Anybody who says they know what to do with it is probably trying to sell you a supplement.
That is probably true. Okay, so I'm startled.
Meaning, look, there's no doubt that the microbiome is an important part of human health. Like I'm not sitting here denying that or saying the earth is flat. There's no doubt that your diet plays an enormous impact on the microbiome. There's no doubt that, a course of antibiotics will alter it. Like all of these things are true, but we're still left with the so what question. I've yet to see an example of where someone can show me that I have a person in whom I detect a problem, I check their microbiome, I make an intervention in response to it that I wouldn't have otherwise made that fixes the problem.
Wow.
I just don't see those examples.
Okay, so man, this is very interesting and important to my life. So I think we talked about this before. My wife, 7 years ago now, I think, had a threshold event where she went from having a manageable gut issue to I was legitimately afraid she was going to die. Her hair was falling out. Her nails were breaking. She couldn't keep anything down. She was in agony at times on the floor, couldn't be picked up. I mean, it was just really, really brutal. She had to do things like swallow cameras, colonoscopy, endoscopy. Like, I mean, she did fucking everything. And this was long enough ago, 7 years, that a lot of doctors only sort of knew what a microbiome was. Like, they didn't know anything about it. They only sort of knew that it existed. And so they couldn't come up with any answers. And it was only through finally getting her tested, realizing she didn't have enough diversity, realizing what we're going to have to do to start building that diversity back. It was a very long journey of figuring out what the things were that she was responding to. Dietary enzymes, probiotics, prebiotics. I mean, just like this whole arsenal. Now, it may just be, we didn't actually, and to be honest, we don't know which of those things worked. And she's said many, because she takes like 26 supplements a day or something. She's like, I don't know, do I still need to take them all? She's like, I have no idea. So she just keeps doing what she's doing.
And we don't know the counterfactual in these situations. And I guess
What do you mean by that?
we don't know what would have happened if you did something different.
Yes, very true.
So this is the problem with this space, is we don't have clinical trials upon which to extract knowledgeable or reliable information.
Why?
I don't know. Probably because there isn't enough financial incentive for the industries that typically want to do this, right? Like if you're an unregulated industry, which is the supplement industry, what incentive do you have to do a clinical trial? You don't require it to sell your product. All you need is marketing. So that's why no supplement company is out there trying to run a clinical trial. Clinical trials are only run by drug companies because they can't sell their product without a gold standard of a clinical trial. So for as much as people want to kind of poo-poo drugs and rah, yay supplements, they should really be thinking about this in the other way. The burden of proof is much higher on a supplement in the sense that we have no clue if it works, let alone if it's not harmful. At least the FDA, for all of its faults, and you won't find many people that are more critical of the FDA than I am. I think it's on the verge of being a corrupt organization. At least it tries to hold drug companies to some level of efficacy and safety. It doesn't always do it, but at least it's trying. At least they're going through those motions. No one's even trying to do that with supplements. I mean, the supplement industry is such a filthy, disgusting industry that even though I take supplements, I stress more about sourcing those than I would ever stress about sourcing pharma.
Okay, so...
In other words, you've got to be really careful where you're getting your supplements. So if I'm using a probiotic, which I do during allergy season...
Interesting, a probiotic. Why?
You know, I live in a part of the world where there are really wicked allergies and I don't want to get them. So I've talked to a few allergists and I've said, look, what can I do prophylactically during this season in Austin where cedar fever is out of control? And they say, well, we don't recommend doing immunotherapy until you actually develop the allergy, blah, 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 blah. But a couple of them have said, look, we recommend this probiotic. We think it might slightly enhance, this element of your immune response. And I'm kind of like, okay, if there's a 5% chance it works and it's not going to hurt me, I'll take the chance because the only thing I'm doing is wasting money. But like, I don't find that to be I do it somewhat reluctantly, right?
It's so interesting to me that the microbiome would play a role in allergies. I mean, I get it because so much of the immune system's there, but it's such a unexpected turn of events for me. Even just the discovery that so much of my immune system resides in my gut was already startling. Okay.
Yeah, again, I think the microbiome is interesting, and I really hope we get to the point where we know how to manipulate it.
Do you look at the research on that, or are you waiting for something more stable to come out?
I intermittently do, but I don't follow that research nearly as closely as what I'm following other things. So it's sort of like every year I'll go back and do a little dive into it with the team and say, okay, what is there anything we know today? And year upon year upon year, we kind of come back to the same conclusion, which is nothing exciting to report yet. I mean, there are edge cases, right? So fecal transplantation, obviously very efficacious in some people.
Do you worry about FMT?
I mean, there are huge risks associated with it, as you know. So it's something that should only be done when the risks are justified by the alternative of not doing it.
Yeah, we were maybe a month away from me doing fecal microbial transplant with Lisa because I was just like, this is scary.
Yeah, understandable.
But for reasons of, it just felt like blood transfusions from like the 70s or something, where it's like, are they scanning for the right things? Yeesh, very terrifying.
Yeah.
So what would you have done if I'd come to you with Lisa and said, hey, she's always had gut problems?
I would have sent you to someone who does that. Like, again, I'm not saying that.
Who though? Like nobody seems to know. Like when I say we finally, even I couldn't resolve it for her as much as I was learning and meeting with experts. Like she finally just had to be like, when I eat this, what do I feel? When I eat this, what do I feel?
Yeah. I mean, again, this is not my area of expertise, so I wouldn't act like it was.
You'd be like, I don't know.
Yeah. I'm really happy telling people I don't know. There's more things I don't know than I do know.
Yeah. That is, that's something that a lot of people struggle with. I definitely fall into the other camp where I feel like I know just enough to be like, do this, come back, report. So it was really interesting reading your book, seeing how much of the things that I felt like, in fact, I'll say this another way. I have a weird emotional hang up. Like I wanted to say the sentence that I'm going to stop doing intermittent fasting and start doing what you're talking about. And I probably should. Do I have orthorexia? This is a very interesting question. I feel it's so easy for me to maintain my body composition through intermittent fasting. It's very easy for me to maintain my satiety through intermittent fasting. It's when I click over into ketosis, I find that my relationship to hunger is different. But you did say that. Mm-hmm. That if I'm doing it for body composition reasons, fair enough. That's very interesting. So one thing that I know I'm just thinking out loud here, one thing that I do often wonder about with my own physique is protein intake and muscle hardness. When I'm being really consistent with working out and I take my carbs up, my muscles get really hard. Will I have a similar effect by...
And you know why that is, right?
The glycogen is being pushed into the muscles.
It's more water, right? So more carbs means more glycogen. Every molecule of glycogen is bringing 3 molecules of water. So you're filling up the muscle.
Okay. So then is there none of that relevance with protein? Because I was going to say like...
It's different, right? So protein is contributing to the sarcomere, the functional unit of the muscle. That's the part that's contracting, right? Mm-hmm. That's the functional piece of the muscle. So that's what's increasing the synthesis of the muscle, and that obviously contributes to size, but it contributes just as much to function. But creatine, will add size to muscle through water retention. Carbohydrates will add glycogen and water to muscle. These things are important for performance also, by the way. So they're not just an aesthetic thing. So carbohydrates, creatine, water, protein synthesis, all of this matters to muscle.
If I were eating more protein, would you expect my muscles to feel more firm? What am I going to be able to increase my strength more? Like assuming that I hold my workouts the same, because I'm trying to think through, do I change my diet or do I just keep doing what I'm doing now? What I'm doing now is easy, but I always thought I was getting autophagy. So it depends.
I don't know how you're working out. So I don't know right now what you're limited by. Are you limited by amino acids, or are you limited by progressive overload? Or are you limited by some other factor? So
meaning I'm not overloading the muscle enough.
Yeah. Are you putting enough stress on the muscle or not? Do you have a high enough testosterone or not? Do you have enough amino acid or not? Any of those things can be the bottleneck. And are you at the limit of your genes, right? Like all of these things start to matter. Now, my guess is virtually nobody is at the limit of their genes except for bodybuilders. So I'm not at the limit of my genes. What am I at the limit of right now? Probably, and I'm not at the limit of protein anymore. I'm probably at the limit of how hard I'm willing to train, how much I'm willing to train. And I'm probably at the limit of testosterone as well, because my T is pretty low. So I can't answer the question for you, what is more protein going to do? Because I would need a lot more information to understand like how you're training, what's your training volume, what's your training intensity, and all of those factors.
Okay. So one thing while I have you that I will say is my limitation. When I think about what holds my physique back, I get injured a lot, and I get injured in a very specific, repeatable way, which I think has to do with stability, which you cover in the book. So I have a very weak middle back, and I compensate for everything by shrugging my traps. So it almost doesn't matter what I'm doing. Brushing my teeth, I will suddenly realize, Jesus, and I have to like remind myself to, I think it's retract my scapular. Like I'm pulling that sort of mid-back girdle down. In the book, you go into how you can rewire the way that your brain has learned to control your musculature. What is that process? I have injured my trap. You're going to think I'm exaggerating. I've injured my trap 115 times over the 20 years.
When you say
of working
injured
out.
your trap, say more.
Sent it into spasm. So where I can't turn my head or I can't tilt my head. Literally last night in bed, I was rolling over. So just adjusting my posture, and it went. And I was like, you've got to be fucking kidding. And so then I couldn't fall back asleep because I could just feel it tightening and tightening and tightening and tightening. That is the thing that has held me back for forever. It's the first injury I ever received. The first day in the gym doing an overhead press, it went, and I thought I was dying at that point. I was like, what the fuck? Yeah, I've injured it probably at least 115 times.
Again, it would be impossible for me to kind of give you the diagnostic here, but I think if you think about the way I kind of go through that stability chapter, it starts with respiration. So the first thing we'd have to understand is, what's your respiratory strategy? So are you overinflated, underinflated, chest breathing only, abdomen breathing only, all of these things? Are you chest out? Are you hunched over? Like, you'd want to go through, how do you correct your respiration strategy? And then you'd want to look at, do you have, for example, segmental control of your spine? Most people do not.
I can't imagine.
Yeah. So until you have segmental control of the spine, you are always going to disproportionately put force at various hinge points in the spine. Do you have thoracic mobility of your spine? Sounds like you don't have thoracic mobility of the spine. Do you have
What is thoracic mobility?
So are you able to rotate through the thoracic spine? So you have a cervical spine, thoracic spine is the longest segment, and then the lumbar spine. So most people don't have segmental
It's
control.
like people that like twist themselves on a chair, that kind of thing? Like, how would you do that?
Yeah, but if you do twist, where are you twisting through? Where is the torsion? What part of the spine?
For me, almost certainly lower back.
Exactly. That would be the most common. So most people are excessively applying torsion in the lumbar spine, and you want to be able to dissipate it through the whole spine. Also, when you talk about the flexion extension of the spine, and by the way, we made a bunch of videos, because you can't explain all this stuff in words. So in the book, there's a link to like videos where I go through what these things look like. But being able to do a segmental cat-cow exercise is a really good way to see if you have segmental control of extension and flexion of the spine from head to tail. Then we get into sort of, do you have scapular control through the full range of motion, through all four phases? So protraction, retraction, elevation, depression. Again, very few people can control their scapula through those things. So stability and movement are, intertwined very intimately. And if you're trying to unpack these injuries, you generally have to go back to the breath, training yourself how to breathe properly, training yourself how to move properly. And there are two schools of thought that I have relied on very heavily in my journey here and that of my patients. And that one is called Dynamic Neuromuscular Stabilization, DNS. The other is called Postural Restoration Institute, PRI.
Bringing everything that I've learned from this conversation and the book today, tell me if this makes sense. So I would like to add more muscle to my frame.
Do you know how much muscle mass you have right now?
I don't.
Have you had a DEXA scan?
I haven't, man. I'm really I love that stuff, but because no one's coming to my house to do it, I haven't gotten tested. It'd be very interesting.
You can't do it at your house. You kind of have to go to the machine.
I'm willing to do it.
Yeah.
I would be very keen to figure that out. One, I want to see if I have any.
Well, you should get a baseline,
fat.
and you should figure out like where you are. Where do you stack up right now in terms of muscle mass? If for no other reason, then you can evaluate your progress. If let's say you test your ALMI, it's at the 70th percentile, that's great. But do you want it to be at the 80th percentile? Well, this way you can figure out if the changes you're making are going to move you in the right direction or not.
All right. So making my goal maybe even more broad is something you talk about in the book, which is the centenarian decathlon. So what are the things you want to be able to do when you're older? You better be scoring very high on them, depending on what part of your age you're in now, because it's all going to decline as you get older. So here are the things I feel like I should be implementing based
How old are
on,
you?
I'm 47.
Okay. And so what do you want to be able to do 40 to 50 years from now?
I want to be able to be very independent from a mobility perspective. So I love the idea of being able to, when I'm flying to Mars, to be able to hold, I guess, before we blast off, be able to put luggage above my head. So yeah, I want to be able to travel, put things above my head. I don't want to lose a lot of my strength. I want to
And if you want to go to Mars, by the way, you're going to have to tolerate pretty high G forces. So think about the neck strength
Nice.
that's going to be required to do that.
Yes. Also, I would just like to not have constant trap injuries. That'd be amazing.
Yep.
I want to be able to play video games.
Okay. Tell me, I don't play video games. I do drive a simulator though, so that's probably similar.
I would guess not from the perspective of what I struggle with. So
tell me what you struggle
I had
with.
so much wrist inflammation for so long. I think a lot about inflammation. Keep that down. So thank you, by the way. You're encouraging me to add fat to my diet allowed me to go from basically never being able to play video games to I can now play as much as I want on Saturday, which I mean, I'm sure I could play more than that, but that's just from a time allocation standpoint. So that's been a huge win. So being able to do that, sex, huge thing in my life. So being able to whatever that takes. So a certain amount of flexibility, I imagine, stamina, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, aesthetics. I want to look good. I want to be strong, look strong. Something cognitive, like being super sharp, that would be really important.
Well, I
to me.
mean, if you're playing video games, presumably you've got to have pretty decent cognition, right? You've got to have certain skills, and depending on if you want to be doing this.
Yeah, also true. I don't need to pick up grandchildren. That would be the maybe one deviation from what a lot of people want to be able to do. But being able to be physically active, I mean, take sex as my, like, I want to be able to do that to the fullest. So given all of those things, here's sort of how I see this now breaking out. Sleep, which we didn't really get into, but I'm going to need to get sleep. That's going to be super important. I'm going to need to identify, given my family history, I think it's either going to be cancer or heart disease. Neither are sort of overwhelmingly prevalent. But those would be the two where grandparents died of that. So certainly want to be thoughtful about that. So I'd identified those two horsemen. So I'm going to be really thoughtful around my diet, making sure that I don't have fat spilling out, that I'm really thoughtful about the ApoB. That's the one that gets into my cell walls, arterial walls.
Yeah, and you do need to check your Lp(a), which is the thing we talked about as well, that is genetic and occurs in about 8% to 12% of people.
Okay, so paying attention to my diet, the adjustment that I'm thinking about making my diet, I'm going to test not doing intermittent fasting, see what that does for my muscle mass. Eating more protein. I have a feeling I might be lower in protein, though I haven't counted up the eggs. I eat a lot of eggs. And then I'm really curious to see about cycling rapamycin. So what is your cycle on rapamycin?
I just dose it once a week. Just take
one dose once a week.
Yep.
Okay. Very interesting. Trying that. What other changes? I feel
that's, you're gonna have to have a doctor help you with that. That's not an over the counter.
Yeah. For sure. I obviously would be doing this on the back of a lot of blood testing to make sure that I am that I know what my baseline is, B, that I'm actually getting the result that I want to see. So yeah, looking at the number on the cholesterol that we were talking about earlier, grip strength is going to be one.
Again, not sitting around with one of those like little grip squeezers, because that's not really what it's about. It's how do you develop grip strength? You develop it by carrying heavy things, right? So, this morning I was deadlifting, and because I was doing it in the hotel and I didn't have chalk, I was failing in grip today. Like, it's actually funny. My hands and my forearms are still sore 5 hours later because I was really at the limits of what I could do without chalk, and I didn't have anything else. So yeah, I was deadlifting, but think about how much I was doing for my upper body, even though that's a lower body activity. Doing farmer carries, something I love doing. I mean, I'm always trying to figure out a way to use my upper body to maximize the relationship between grip and shoulder. So think of it less as like very specific tests that you do, and think of it more as the broader activity you need to do to produce that. So grip strength is just an integral of upper body strength.
All right. So if that is my sort of fumbly way through the changes that I'm going to make, if somebody wants to outlive and they come to you at that cocktail party and you just cannot get away from them and you have to answer the question in a succinct way, what do people need to do to maximize the human life expectancy?
There is no sentence I can give any person to tell them what the prescription is, right? I mean, if I could, I wouldn't have written a 500-page book. There's no chance. Believe me, I didn't want to write I wasn't looking for things to do, right? The reason this is complicated is that it's complicated. And two people can have two very different prescriptions. If I'm at that cocktail party and the person I'm talking to, after a few minutes, I figure out that their biggest issue is that they're not sleeping, or that, they're sleeping 4 hours a night. Nothing else. I'm not going to really waste time talking about protein with them. We've got to figure out why they're not sleeping 7 to 9 hours a night. And how much of that is sleep hygiene? How much of that is underlying pathology like sleep apnea or restless leg syndrome? How much of that is alcohol? How much of that, like, you have to get to the root of that problem. But if you're sleeping 4 hours a night, that's the elephant in the room. If you're not exercising at all and you're sleeping well and you're sort of eating okay, like, none of that other stuff matters. You need to get exercising. If you have type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome, we have to get you exercising and changing your diet and all those other things. So again, I'm not being difficult because I don't want to give glib answers. I'm not giving a glib answer because there isn't one.
If you want to learn how waking up at 3:30 a.m. can completely change your life, be sure to click here. Check it out. Your life will change forever the moment that you decide to get up early and really attack your day. Go to bed at the same time every day.